Welcome to Whispers of History. Tonight we begin a tale woven through smoky parchment, flickering candlelight, and trembling medieval hearts. You're standing on cobbled stone in the shadow of a crumbling castle wall, and the scent of damp moss and iron hangs thick in the air. Above you, carved into the stone of the archway, is a scaly beast with wide wings and a serpent's stare, proof at least to the locals that dragons once flew here. You see, in the medieval mind, dragons weren't just tales for children or symbols in dusty books. They were real, veiled as wolves in the forest or taxes from the crown. They lived just out of sight, deep in mountains, under lakes, or crouched behind the hills that no peasant dared wander. People didn't speak of dragons as legends. They were part of the landscape, just another beast to fear alongside plague and hunger. And honestly, you probably won't survive this story. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not drop a comment below with your location and the time you're listening. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk into a village where rumors crawl faster than chickens underfoot. A shepherd swears his sheep disappeared under claw marks. A baker says her flour wagon was overturned near the woods by something with scales. And everyone agrees it must be a dragon. This wasn't considered strange. In the same way you accept traffic lights or weather forecasts, medieval folks accepted dragons. They were simply there. The Bible itself hinted at beasts of great danger, often interpreted as literal dragons. The Leviathan, that sounded suspiciously draconic. Add to that ancient Roman texts passed down through monastic libraries. Pliny the Elder, for example, wrote of serpents so large they could block roads, and it all built into a worldview where dragons slithered just outside the known world. Even reputable scholars, the ones who wore robes and corrected people's Latin, didn't scoff. Theologians saw dragons as symbols of Satan, but also as real things created by God, corrupted by sin, and roaming the earth to test the faithful. If you saw a dragon in the 13th century, you were more likely to be offered holy water than therapy. Dragons were convenient for explaining the unexplained. A wildfire must be a dragon. Mysterious deaths. Maybe a beast was feeding. A knight didn't return from a quest, likely roasted. He fought bravely, they'd say, while quietly moving his belongings into the church storeroom. You might think, surely someone would have asked for proof. But here's the thing. They had it. Dragon bones on display in churches. Monks would lead you to the crypt and show off huge skulls or femurs that today we'd recognize as woolly mammoth or even whale bones. But who in the 12th century had seen a whale, or for that matter, a museum curator? Then there were the maps. Oh, the glorious maps. Edge-of-the-world illustrations with writhing beasts lurking in ocean corners. Here be dragons. They warned not metaphorically, but with genuine caution. Travelers might pause, squint at the curled tail wrapping around an island, and think, maybe let's just stay home this year. Historians still argue whether the belief in dragons stemmed more from oral folklore or direct misinterpretations of fossils and ancient writings. Some say dragons were the inevitable product of lonely terrain plus an overactive imagination. Others believe dragons were deeply useful politically and religiously tools to terrify, to inspire, and to remind the masses to stay obedient. You, of course, are skeptical. You've seen CGI. You've read fantasy novels. But imagine living in a world where most people never traveled more than 10 miles from home, where forests weren't pretty, they were threats, where the night crept in with wolves, shadows, and the creaking of something definitely bigger than a boar. It wasn't all fear, though. Dragons were strangely respected. They were powerful, ancient, clever. Killing one gave you instant prestige. Even claiming to have seen one could earn you a free pint or some bread from a wide-eyed innkeeper. They appeared in dreams, too often seen as omens of future greatness. If you dreamt of flying on a dragon's back, someone might whisper that you were destined for kingship or demonic possession. It really depended on the vibe. Quirkier still were the folk remedies. Dragon ashes mixed with goose fat were said to ward off fevers. Drinking water from a stream near a known dragon lair was believed to boost fertility. There was even a superstition in southern France that dragon scales ground into powder could help cure lovesickness. Imagine that powdered lizard heartbreak remedies sold by candlelight. As the evening chill creeps through your blanket and the sound of imagined wings stirs in the wind, you begin to wonder, what if the dragons weren't just stories? What if something real, something big, something prehistoric left just enough clues to stir centuries of belief? You shift slightly in your seat. Maybe that creak on the floorboards wasn't the house settling. Maybe it's just an old story stretching its wings again. You're standing in a crumbling chapel, moonlight pouring through a shattered stained glass window. The shadows twist, and there behind the altar you see it. Not the cross, not the relics, but a stone covering of a dragon curled at the feet of a devilish figure. Its eyes are hollow, its mouth agape, as if hissing across time. You're not imagining this. In the medieval mind, dragons weren't just monsters, they were minions. Specifically, the devil's favorites. It made sense, really. The dragon, with its coiled tail, sulphurous breath, and appetite for destruction, fit perfectly into Christian allegory. It was too terrible, too chaotic, too serpentine not to be associated with Satan himself. And remember, this was a world where even cats could be accused of witchcraft. So a fire-breathing sky serpent, that thing had Lucifer's name written all over it. You were taught, if you lived back then, that dragons were punishment. They were manifestations of sin. Gluttony, pride, the 7 deadly sins with wings and talons. A town that fell into debauchery, smited by dragon. A king who turned greedy, roasted kingdom. Even earthquakes and crop failures might be chalked up to a particularly moody hell dragon stomping beneath the soil. One of the most widespread tales tying dragons to the devil comes from the book of Revelation. And behold, a great red dragon. That's a direct quote, one that sent medieval illustrators into a frenzy. They drew beasts with 7 heads, each one barfing fire or clutching souls in their teeth. A real graphic design nightmare. These images weren't metaphors in the medieval church, they were warnings. And those stained glass depictions you now admire with a cup of tea, back then, they were practically disaster preparedness manuals. Still, not everyone agreed on the details. Historians still argue whether the dragon as devil idea emerged as a way to scare converts, or if it grew naturally out of blending pagan serpent myths with Christian theology. Some even believe the church exaggerated dragon tales to demonize older pre-Christian nature deities, many of which were awkwardly associated with snakes and reptiles. And here's a cheeky twist: some of the dragons were said to serve Satan not just as brute force soldiers, but as messengers. Yes, flaming pigeon post. One 12th century French manuscript describes a dragon who delivered cursed scrolls to isolated monasteries, no word on whether it waited for a reply. Some particularly edgy theologians describe dragons as test creatures, sent by God, yes, but manipulated by the devil. Think of them as demonic interns here to check if you'd resist sin or run screaming into the woods. Your odds of success? Not great. Villagers responded to this hellish theory in the most medieval way possible by organizing processions, ringing church bells, and flinging holy water at suspicious clouds. If the sun turned red at dusk, someone somewhere blamed it on a dragon flapping too close to heaven. The sky was seen as both battlefield and billboard broadcasting spiritual warfare in every shade of gold and crimson. In some regions, particularly parts of Germany and Bohemia, local priests gave special sermons during droughts or plagues that mentioned dragon winds or beasts of the deep. These weren't just poetic devices. People believed them. The dragon was here not just in the scriptures, but in the fields, the rivers, the skies above your barn. And if your cow was acting funny, well, you might want to check under the hay. But dragons weren't just the devil's minions. They were his personality, his marketing, his brand, a snake with wings. That's temptation and destruction in one convenient package. No wonder every depiction of the devil in later art leaned into the horns, the scales, the tail. They didn't need to invent an icon. They just ripped off the local dragon and called it Satan. And yet, as terrifying as they were, dragons had a strange allure. Think about it. If you believed the devil had personal pets that flew across the sky, didn't that make the whole cosmic battle feel kind of cinematic? These weren't dry sermons. This was the ultimate fantasy series, with high-stakes evil mascots and dramatic flair. No wonder people kept dragon stories alive. They added spice to sermons and urgency to virtue. Still, not everyone cowered. Some saw dragons not as threats, but as challenges, terrifying, yes, but conquerable, a worthy adversary for a true hero, or at least someone with a lance and very little concern for survival. And we'll get to those brave and possibly overconfident souls soon enough. For now, you take one last look at the carving behind the chapel altar. The dragon's wings are folded, its tail wraps around a skull, and its stone lips seem to curl into a grin. Maybe it's waiting for a command from below, or maybe it's waiting for you. You've wandered far from the village now, boots squelching through mud and moss, branches brushing your cloak like cold fingers. The forest thickens, the air chills, and every bird seems to have gone silent. You glance upward, and there, just visible beyond the trees, is the looming mouth of a cave, carved into the mountainside, like a wound in the world. If you were a medieval peasant, this is where you'd stop, because everyone knew what lived in caves. Dragons. Of course they did. Where else would a giant winged, sulfur-breathing beast hide? Certainly not behind the village bakery. No dragons preferred isolation. High cliffs, deep chasms, mountain crags, blanketed in fog anywhere that no one but the most foolish or fated might dare to tread. And if you did, well, congratulations. You'd just become a medieval snack. These dragon lairs weren't just fantasy tropes. They were mapped, feared, and whispered about with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints' tombs or haunted wells. In the Austrian Alps, villagers told of dragons sleeping in ice-crusted caves, only emerging during lightning storms to scorch the valley below. In Wales, it was the hills that pulsed with danger, specifically Dinas Emrys, where a red dragon and white dragon were said to have battled beneath the surface, shaking the very earth. You'd be forgiven for asking why these massive, noisy creatures weren't seen more often. But medieval logic had an answer. Dragons were secretive. Shy, even, like grumpy forest hermits. They preferred solitude and only emerged when disturbed hungry or dramatically annoyed. Their ability to blend into the mountains, to glide silently through the clouds, was never questioned. After all, if God could create angels invisible to the naked eye, why couldn't he or the devil make dragons that only showed themselves when it mattered? Interestingly, many old tales link dragons to volcanic regions. Mount Etna, for instance, was rumored to house more than just lava. According to a 13th century Sicilian manuscript, the roaring of the volcano wasn't magma, it was a dragon groaning in its sleep. Which, let's be honest, feels like the medieval version of the pipes are just old. Historians still argue whether these associations were inspired by ancient memories of real animal migrations, crocodiles in North Africa perhaps, or if they were simply a very colorful way to explain earthquakes and smoke plumes. One thing is clear, geography and fear had a tight friendship in medieval minds. The more remote, the more dangerous. The darker the cave, the more likely it was home to something with scales and opinions about livestock. Of course, cave dragons weren't just natural disasters with wings. They had lairs. And lairs meant treasure. This is where the lore gets juicier. You see, dragons didn't just live in empty holes. They hoarded gold jewels, relics, occasionally, the bones of less successful visitors. Why dragons wanted treasure is unclear. Maybe they were just bad at banking. Maybe, like a medieval smog, they enjoyed the aesthetic. Either way, the idea that deep in the mountain was not just danger, but unimaginable wealth made the risks feel worth it. For some. And this wasn't just peasant gossip. Entire quests were built around the idea of slaying a mountain dragon. In the Icelandic sagas, warriors ventured into icy caves with nothing but a sword and a song. In Central Europe, folk ballads tell of young men disappearing into ravines, seeking glory, or at least enough gold to pay off the local lord. One quirky example, the legend of the Dragon of Knin, a Croatian tale, in which a young blacksmith allegedly entered a mountain armed with only a horseshoe and came out with a scorched tunic, a limp, and a golden goblet. Did he kill the dragon? Unclear. Did he market the story into a steady tavern income? Absolutely. Even more peculiar are the stories of people trying to live near dragons. Yes, believe it or not, some brave or possibly deluded souls believed dragons could be reasoned with. They'd build huts near known hotspots, offering tribute cows, chickens, or bread in hopes of protection. One monk's notes describe a small hamlet in what's now Slovenia, where locals left offerings by a cave mouth each equinox to soothe the beast within. Was it a dragon? Probably a bear. But again, if you can't explain it, why not escalate it? You begin to notice a pattern. The deeper into the wilderness you go, the louder the dragon stories get. Dragons didn't live in cities. They didn't like stone walls or cathedrals or sermons. They lived on the edge of the map where logic gave way to fear and forests stretched wider than belief. They were the border between civilization and chaos. So, if you were hiking through the Pyrenees in the 12th century, stumbled upon a cave with bones at the entrance and a curious sulfur smell you didn't investigate, you crossed yourself, tossed in a prayer, and walked faster. Maybe left behind a bit of cheese as a bribe, just in case. And here you are now at the mouth of a cave centuries later. No bones, no smoke, just silence and your imagination rustling in the undergrowth. Perhaps dragons never lived here, or perhaps they're just better at hiding than we thought. You finally left the cliffs behind, but your path now winds beside a still, bottomless lake. The surface doesn't ripple even as the wind brushes its skin. It just stares back at you dark and ancient. And if you were a medieval traveler, you'd clutch your cloak tighter because this is exactly the kind of lake where dragons sleep. Not all dragons lived in caves or atop misty peaks. Some, you were warned, curled up beneath the water, their massive bodies coiled around the lake bed like sunken snakes. These were the guardians of the deep, the watchers of lakes and bogs and pools so black that even daylight felt unwelcome. And they didn't breathe fire. They exhaled steam. Medieval people didn't need modern biology to understand that something dangerous might lurk beneath still waters. Eels were weird, frogs were loud, and sometimes the water just swallowed things. A cow wandering too close, a child chasing a skipping stone, a whole cart of barley sucked into a sinkhole mid-crossing. What else could cause that, except a water dragon rolling over in its sleep? Stories of lake dragons appeared all over Europe. In Switzerland, villagers feared the Tatzel worm said to rise from mountain pools and drag sheep underwater. In the British Isles, people swore by tales of the Afonk, a lake monster with claws and glowing eyes, sometimes a dragon, sometimes a demon, always a problem. These weren't vague legends, they were warnings etched into folk memory. Don't go near the lake at night, the beast wakes hungry. And it wasn't just Europe. Islamic manuscripts described creatures like the Bahamut, a colossal beast beneath the sea, so vast its movements were said to cause earthquakes. While not always labeled dragon, the description fits enormous, ancient, unseen. The kind of thing that made you feel very, very small. Historians still argue Whether these lake dragon myths emerged from real encounters with massive eels, sturgeon, or crocodiles transported in stories from abroad. Others think the origin is psychological. Humans have always feared what we can't see beneath dark water. The silence, the pressure, the way reflections shimmer just enough to hide something watching back. Fringe theories add flair, of course. Some say lake dragons were inspired by dinosaur fossils exposed near dried-up lakes. Others blame methane pockets erupting from bogs, mistaking the bubbling foul stench for the breath of something foul and alive. And one enthusiastic 19th century folklorist even proposed that early medieval folks mistook mating toads for a dragon's undulating back. Bit of a leap, but points for imagination. You'd think that if these dragons were aquatic, they'd be less destructive than their cave-dwelling cousins. Wrong. These beasts didn't roast you, they boiled you. In the German town of Klagenfurt, a centuries-old legend tells of a lindworm who lived in a nearby lake and was so foul-tempered it poisoned the water for miles. It took an ox-sized bait trap and a dozen nervous townsfolk to finally slay the beast, or at least trap something large enough to hang in the city square for dramatic effect. Even more dramatic. The idea that some of these dragons weren't alone. In certain monastic texts, lakes were described as portals, with dragons as guardians keeping mortals out, or worse, things in. You weren't just avoiding one beast. You were staying away from the entire underworld leaking into your landscape. Sleep tight. And here's where things get even murkier. In some regions, people believed these lake dragons weren't entirely physical. They were spirits, illusions, or even curses. Tales from Ireland speak of lakes that formed overnight after a dragon's rage cracked the earth. Others claim the dragons were the lake's shapeshifters who turned from wings and teeth into still water, waiting to reclaim their form once the stars aligned or someone spoke a forbidden word. Quirky Twist, one 14th century Welsh poem, warns against bathing in dragon-touched water, suggesting you might catch visions, madness, or a tongue of flame in the throat. Was that metaphorical? Possibly. But more likely it meant don't be stupid. The lake's cursed go wash somewhere else. Despite the fear, lake dragons were also treated with a degree of reverence. Offerings were tossed into deep pools, coins bread wreaths of herbs. Not as bribes exactly, more like insurance. You'd honor the beast so it wouldn't notice you passing by, much like saying hello to a bee and slowly walking away, but with higher stakes and fewer stingers. Even the church got in on the act. Some lakes, especially those with persistent fog, were declared haunted by unclean spirits, but occasionally they'd build a chapel nearby just in case a saint wanted to swing by and perform a little holy eviction. Spoiler saints rarely showed up on time. You crouch now by the water's edge. No ripples, no bubbles, just still black glass reflecting your uncertain expression. You toss in a pebble. It vanishes. No splash, no sound. Only the soft echo of your breath and a distant rumble, probably thunder. Probably. You rise, brush off your cloak, and walk a little faster. After all, everyone knows what stirs when the mist rolls in. You're trudging through a dust-choked trail, the the sun pounding down on your hood like it's got a personal vendetta. The road twists through olive groves and barren hills, and every shadow feels longer than it should. You're far from home now, in the blistering heart of the Holy Land. And back in the medieval age, pilgrims swore that somewhere out here, beyond the heat, shimmer, and the camel carts lurked dragons. Yes, real ones. To the average European Christian of the Middle Ages, the Holy Land wasn't just the cradle of Christendom. It was also the place where everything had happened: biblical miracles, plagues, divine battles, and apparently dragon attacks. Because if dragons were Satan's agents, then of course they'd be drawn to the place where heaven had once walked. Pilgrims returning from Jerusalem didn't just bring back crosses and dirt-filled reliquaries. They brought stories, harrowing ones, of beasts coiled around desert pillars, of monstrous serpents sleeping near ancient ruins of winged shadows that passed overhead while they huddled in fear at night. Were all these tales truthful? Probably not. Were they believed? Oh, absolutely. One persistent legend involved a dragon dwelling near the River Jordan, said to awaken during eclipses and poison the fish. Another tale, whispered in Crusader camps, told of a desert canyon where no bird would fly because a beast too ancient for scripture lay dreaming beneath the sands. These accounts often blended seamlessly with apocryphal biblical stories. The idea of Satan roaming the desert like a lion, well, that lion had wings now and breathed fire. You can thank a few imaginative monks and a lack of first-hand zoological knowledge for that upgrade. Historians still argue whether the stories were intended to be taken literally. Some suggest they were metaphors for the trials and temptations faced by pilgrims' spiritual dragons in a scorched land. Others believe they were exaggerated encounters with local wildlife, monitor lizards, snakes, or even crocodiles, viewed through the haze of fear, hunger, and sunstroke. A few fringe thinkers even speculate that ancient Middle Eastern cultures passed down memories of extinct creatures that Europeans mistook for dragons. Giant snakes, sure. Prehistoric crocodiles, maybe. One ambitious chronicler claimed to have seen a dragon track the size of a cartwheel etched in dry clay near the Dead Sea. It was probably a camel print, but belief didn't require proof. If your friend came back from pilgrimage 2 years older and 20 pounds thinner, rambling about monsters and angels, and how he watched a demon lizard roast a goat from 30 feet away, you didn't argue. You bought him ale and asked whether the dragon had scales or feathers. One thing's clear: the East was exotic, dangerous, and dripping with meaning. For medieval minds, it was the edge of the known world, a place where ancient sins slept and holy relics glittered sometimes in the claws of creatures that definitely didn't show up in your hometown. Even respectable clerics got swept up in it. A 12th century bishop wrote of a Draco Ingen's great dragon that nested near the ruins of Babylon, surrounded by scorched earth and bones. He claimed no knight could approach without divine blessing or a very large spear. The location, of course, is vague. The dragon unverified, the story widely copied and lovingly embellished by generations of armchair scribes who'd never set foot outside Burgundy. And the Crusaders didn't help. Imagine being a soldier half-starved and baking in chainmail under the Syrian sun. You see a long shadow stretch over a rock. Your mind addled by heat, and fear fills in the rest. You want it to be a dragon. It's better than thinking about dysentery or missing your mother's stew. One quirky tale from the First Crusade involves a group of knights claiming they fought a sky serpent near Antioch. It had no wings, they said, but flew anyway. It spat fire and vanished into a cloud of dust. More likely, a sandstorm perhaps sparked by a meteorological hiccup. But tell that to the bard singing about it 2 months later at a tavern in Marseille. Not all dragon tales in the East were terrifying. Some were majestic. A few chroniclers spoke of divine dragons, celestial beings of flame and light that appeared as signs of God's favor. One Byzantine soldier wrote of seeing a shimmering golden serpent in the sky during a siege and took it as a vision of Saint Michael himself. Yes, it was probably just a comet. But when your life is reduced to surviving 1 week at a time, a flaming dragon overhead feels like prophecy. Medieval maps reflected these beliefs too. The further east you went, the more elaborate the beasts became. Asia Minor, dragon territory. Persia, thick with serpents. Arabia, just don't even. Here be dragons wasn't some metaphorical flourish. It was a literal warning to seafarers and pilgrims alike. And let's not forget trade. With spices and silks came tales from Eastern merchants, stories of serpentine gods, fire-eyed creatures from the stars and dragons that could speak human tongues. Europeans, of course, misheard, mistranslated, and mythologized. What was once a wise temple guardian in Chinese folklore became in Western hands a gold-thirsty lizard hiding in a cave. You crest a hill now and see the desert stretch endlessly before you. No dragons, just stones, wind, and silence. But in the heat shimmer, the land moves. Just a flicker, a mirage, or maybe, just maybe, something old still sleeps beneath the dust. You rest for a moment under a crooked oak, staring at a crude carving on its trunk, 2 curved lines with what looks like wings scrawled above them. Maybe it's a dragon, maybe it's someone's attempt at a goat. But either way, it speaks to a very real medieval problem. No one could quite agree on what dragons actually were. You'd think that with all the fire and mayhem, there'd be consensus. Nope. In fact, the debate over whether dragons were giant lizards, magical snakes, or demon wind hybrids was just as fiery as the dragons themselves. A sort of academic slap fight conducted entirely through illuminated manuscripts. Some descriptions called them serpents, long, legless, and slick, slithering through forests like nightmare noodles. Others insisted they were more like lions, but with bat wings and scales. Some had eagle talons. Some breathed fire, others spat venom. There were even rumors of dragons with beards. That's right, scaly, flying, fire-breathing creatures with facial hair. You try keeping a straight face when that shows up on your family crest. This wasn't just folklore inconsistency, it was deeply theological. If a dragon was a beast of Satan, it had to fit certain biblical animal categories. But if it was also a test from God or a punishment for sin, Maybe it didn't follow natural rules at all. Theologians went back and forth like scholarly jousters. Was a dragon born, made summoned? Did it have a soul? Could it repent? Spoiler, probably not, but a few curious monks genuinely asked. Even more confusing, some dragons in manuscripts had feathered wings like angels. Others had horns. Some had more than one head. A few were legless, and at least one medieval account, written with a completely straight face, described a dragon as the length of 5 wagons and the color of spoiled mustard. So that clears everything up. Historians still argue whether these variations stemmed from regional myths or from artists just having no idea what they were drawing. Think about it. You've never seen a dragon, but your abbot wants a nice big one drawn on page 42 by morning. You panic. You draw a lizard, add wings, then panic more and throw on tusks and a couple of nostrils shaped like peppermills. Boom. Dragon. Quirkier still, some bestiaries describe dragons as highly intelligent. They could reason, plot, even speak. In one 13th century French tale, a dragon lectures a knight on moral failings mid-duel. That's right, you charge in swinging your sword, and the dragon hits you with ethics. Other sources painted them as dumb brutes easily distracted by jingling metal or confused by mirrors. You never knew if you were getting smog or a scaly Labrador. One popular theory held that dragons were evolved snakes' serpents, so old and corrupted that they had physically mutated. This aligned nicely with the Christian belief that sin could deform the natural world. It also explains why so many illustrations show dragons with serpent-like bodies and forked tongues. Add wings, and you're basically looking at a biblical horror story with a mobility upgrade. Of course, this meant people started looking at regular snakes with suspicion. A big one in your field could be a baby dragon. A particularly aggressive lizard, definitely dragon adjacent. A weird fish with fins that kind of looked like wings. Well, now you've got sea dragons. Congratulations. You live in a world where the line between zoology and apocalypse is very blurry. Even language reflected the chaos. The Latin Draco could mean dragon serpent or a particularly unpleasant person. The Old English worm emphasized the legless serpentine aspect. Meanwhile, in Norse sagas, Ormar referred to dragons that often didn't have wings, just very bad attitudes, and a tendency to guard cursed gold. Depending on where you were, a dragon might fly, slither, burrow, swim, or just glare judgmentally from a hilltop. And of course, the East muddied the waters further. Tales filtering in from Arabic, Persian, and Chinese sources introduced dragons that were wise, benevolent, and sometimes even divine. No fire, no carnage, just cosmic noodles floating through heaven. Naturally, European scribes didn't know what to do with that. Some called them celestial worms, others dismissed them as fanciful lies. A few, though just a few, wondered if dragons weren't all evil, that maybe there were kinds, breeds, maybe even good dragons. You start to notice something strange. The less people agreed on what dragons looked like, the more common they seemed to become. It's as if ambiguity helped them thrive. The moment no one could pin them down, they could appear anywhere. A shadow in a storm, a shape in the waves, a rumble underground. Dragons became folklore, Swiss army knives, useful for any occasion. So now you look again at that tree carving. Are those wings? Or a farmer's crude doodle of a goose attack? You'll never know. But to someone centuries ago, that was enough to say, a dragon passed this way. And maybe, just maybe, it did. You're walking along a rutted trail toward the ruins of an old shrine when you pass a small stone marker, weathered, cracked, almost buried in weeds. At first, it looks like any other forgotten relic until you notice what's etched faintly into its face, a haloed man driving a spear through the throat of a snarling beast. The dragon lies coiled beneath him, its wings limp, its mouth agape in eternal agony. You've just stumbled upon one of the most popular images in all of medieval Europe, saint versus dragon. Forget fairy tales. This was theology in full armor, saints especially, the ones popular with traveling monks and borderland villagers, didn't just preach or heal, they fought. And nothing proved their holiness like squaring off against the devil's favorite reptile. Take St. George, for example. You already know the name. He's been knighted, merchandised, and stamped on more coins than you can count. But back in the Middle Ages, his legend meant dragon slayer. The story goes like this. A town plagued by a terrible dragon tried appeasing it with sheep. When that failed, they offered up maidens. Classic escalation. But just before the king's daughter was fed to the beast, George rode in with a lance, and some divine backup skewered the creature and led the princess back like it was just another Tuesday. What matters isn't whether this happened. What matters is how believable it felt to medieval people. Because they weren't just hearing about a miracle, they were seeing one. Churches displayed images of George slaying the dragon. Cathedrals commissioned sculptures. Traveling priests preached fiery sermons about the sin that bred such beasts and the faith that destroyed them. The dragon wasn't just a monster, it was a metaphor wearing scales. But George wasn't alone. Saint Margaret of Antioch had her own beastly run-in. According to legend, she was swallowed whole by a dragon after refusing to renounce her faith. While inside, she made the sign of the cross and exploded the poor creature from the inside out. Brutal. Also, apparently the origin of every girl boss meme in medieval hagiography. Historians still argue whether these dragon encounters were based on older pagan myths, Thor fighting Jormungandr, for example, or whether they were purely symbolic tales layered onto saints' lives after the fact. There's certainly overlap, but what makes the medieval twist unique is how personal the dragon battles felt. They weren't just ancient myths. They were reminders that evil lurked nearby and faith could stab it in the face. Some scholars suggest the dragon served as a stand-in for regional threats, disease, war, famine. So when Saint Michael was depicted battling a dragon in stained glass, you weren't just admiring art, you were being told to stay pious or risk inviting the beast into your own village. And let's not overlook the quirky bits. One 11th century English manuscript describes a saint who supposedly converted a dragon to Christianity. The dragon apparently bowed its head and agreed to never eat livestock again. The local bishop, understandably suspicious, ordered it exiled to a nearby cave. We don't know what happened after that, but odds are someone drew a map and added, "Here be repentant dragons," near the margin. Some saints didn't kill dragons, but tamed them. Saint Martha, for instance, is said to have subdued a fearsome beast called the Tarasque, an armored, fire-breathing creature that terrorized a French town by sprinkling it with holy water and calmly reading scripture. According to the story, it lay down at her feet like a chastened puppy. Of course, the townspeople then immediately killed it, which says more about them than her. You might laugh now, but these stories carried weight. They reinforced the idea that saints weren't just virtuous, they were powerful. They could command nature, face evil head on, and triumph where armies failed. And in a time when plagues swept through towns and warlords taxed you for the privilege of breathing, the idea of a divine protector slaying a monster was pure, glorious hope. The iconography stuck too. In fact, some of the most famous coats of arms and national symbols like England's Red Cross of St. George draw their cultural power from these dragon-slaying tales. Entire orders of knights were formed around these legends, claiming spiritual descent from the slayers of sin-scaled beasts. Even ordinary folks latched on. Peasants carved dragons into the beams of their barns, not to welcome them, but to show their defiance. "You're not welcome here," the image declared. "Try the village over the hill." You step into the old shrine, now moss tickling your boots, incense long faded into stone. On the back wall is a faded fresco, a saint sword, raised foot planted on a dying dragon. You stand quietly, not out of fear, but out of something stranger, admiration. Because in this world, dragons weren't just real, they were defeatable, and that in the darkness of a long medieval night might have been the most powerful miracle of all. You're nursing a lukewarm mug of something vaguely herbal in a candlelit hall surrounded by maps that stretch far beyond anything your village priest ever mentioned. The room smells like parchment and sweat. Merchants talk in 10 different tongues. Spices coat the air, and somewhere in the din, someone casually mentions a dragon with eyes like rubies from the east. That phrase from the east was medieval Europe's favorite excuse for anything strange, powerful, or unexplainable. The East shimmered in their imaginations like a fever dream, exotic, immense, filled with creatures too elegant or too terrible for local fields. And among all the marvels, it offered silk gold incense. None captured the imagination quite like its dragons, unlike the snarling winged beasts of Western Europe. Eastern dragons, particularly those from Chinese, Persian, and Indian traditions, were often wise, ancient, and shockingly well-behaved. Instead of hoarding gold and roasting knights, they summoned rain, guarded temples, and sometimes, even more suspiciously, talked. To a medieval European, this was baffling. A polite dragon, clearly suspicious, probably possessed. Take the Chinese long. These dragons had long serpentine bodies, deer antlers, fish scales, and whiskers that would put any wizard to shame. They didn't have wings yet. They flew, not because of magic, but because they were natural forces, embodiments of water, wind, and cosmic order. They were celestial bureaucrats. And they didn't burn villages, they brought rain to rice fields. Cue mass confusion in Europe, when travelers on the Silk Road or crusaders stationed in the Levant caught wind of these stories. They scribbled frantic notes into the margins of letters and journals. A dragon that blessed crops, a serpent that advised emperors. It was as though someone had handed them a map of the world and said, "You've been using the wrong dragons this whole time." Historians still argue whether medieval Europeans genuinely believed these foreign dragon tales or simply misunderstood them, often through several layers of translation, cultural assumption, and that classic medieval habit of adding 10 feet and fire breath to anything vaguely lizard-shaped. It didn't help that merchants and monks loved a good embellishment. A Persian storyteller might describe a great snake that protected a mountain pass. By the time that tale reached Paris, it had wings, could speak 7 languages, and once dated Alexander the Great. But not all contact was exaggerated. Arab scholars like al-Qazwini and al-Jahiz described dragons with great precision, some venomous, others enormous, but passive, often linked to deserts or deep waters. These works were eventually translated into Latin, mingling with European bestiaries. The result, a beautifully confusing stew of myth science and wishful thinking. The Eastern dragon soon became a kind of wild card. It didn't fit into neat Christian allegory. Was it evil, holy trick question? It was both and neither, and that made it dangerously interesting. Some scribes tried to reframe them. Maybe Eastern dragons were fallen angels, or dragons before the fall untainted by sin. Or maybe, and this was a spicy one, they were proof that God's plan included wisdom even in monstrous shapes. Quirkier, yet some medieval artists started blending East and West. You'd find illuminated manuscripts with dragons that had the face of a lion, the tail of a fish, and the attitude of a bureaucrat on his 5th cup of wine. These hybrid creatures became popular in maps and margins, especially when trying to explain strange weather, odd creatures, or why someone's caravan never returned. One of the more delightful cases is the Dragones Volucri, the flying dragon described in early Italian texts as having no wings, yet capable of soaring by divine cunning. Likely inspired by gliding lizards from Southeast Asia, these beasts were adopted into European lore with the same casual confidence as garlic into soup. No explanation needed, just dragon things. Even heraldry got in on the act. While the Western dragon was fearsome, armored, and bulky, the Eastern influence brought sleeker, ribbon-like creatures to family crests and castle banners. They looked less like beasts and more like moving calligraphy, a swirl of power and mystery. Imagine rolling into a joust with that on your shield. Instant intimidation and exotic flair. Of course, not everyone was charmed. More conservative church figures viewed these tales with suspicion. Some declared that Eastern dragons were demons in disguise, tempting people with beauty and rain instead of fire. Beware the serpent that blesses you, one monk warned, for its true master may yet hiss through its lips. A little dramatic, but hey, it was the Middle Ages. Drama was the default setting. You sit back now, the candle flickering low, and imagine a distant valley where clouds coil like serpents and a dragon dances through the mist, ancient and slow, not hunting, not hiding, just being. And for the first time, you wonder maybe not all dragons need slaying. The tavern is packed tonight. Too many elbows, too much mead, and just enough lute music to make you question your life choices. You're squeezed between a muddy cartwright and a bearded old man with eyes like chipped flint. He leans close, breath thick with ale, and secrets and whispers. The dragon didn't care about the gold. It watched it. Then he leans back as if that explains everything. Welcome to the world of treasure dragons. The original fantasy hoarders and the nightmare of every medieval accountant. In medieval lore, dragons weren't just flying death machines, they were guardians, specifically of wealth. Gold coins, jeweled goblets, crown fragments, ancient scrolls, enchanted swords. If it sparkled, a dragon wanted it. Or so the stories said. And once it had, no one else ever got near it again. Which of course meant everyone wanted to. One of the most famous dragon hoards in European literature comes from the Volsunga saga, later adapted into Wagner's operas and every fantasy story your nephews ever told you. In it, the dwarf Fafnir murders his father for a cursed treasure, turns into a dragon to protect it, and is eventually slain by the hero Sigurd. The gold still cursed, but that never stopped anyone from trying to grab it. And of course, Beowulf. That scaly menace didn't show up until the end of the poem, but when it did, it brought the heat, literally. The dragon had been guarding a treasure-filled barrow for centuries until some unfortunate thief stole a single cup. One cup, that petty theft triggered an inferno-level meltdown that scorched the entire kingdom. Moral of the story, don't poke the treasure lizard. Historians still argue whether these stories were warnings about greed, metaphors for sin, or just really great excuses for sword fights. But one thing is clear, dragon gold was never free. If you wanted it, you had to fight for it, and even if you won, the price was usually high. Curses, madness, death by gluttony, or, if you were very unlucky, inheriting the dragon's role as the next obsessive treasure hoarder. Fun family business. There's a fringe theory that the image of dragons guarding treasure came from actual burial sites. In regions where barrows or cairns contained royal grave goods, people may have imagined some kind of guardian spirit or literal beast protecting the tomb. Over time, a helpful ghost became a snarling dragon with anxiety issues and a shiny object fixation. Another theory ties dragons to ancient memories of Roman coin hoards. Picture this: a peasant stumbles on a buried amphora full of coins. No idea where it came from, but he doesn't tell anyone. Then someone else finds it empty and spreads a story. I saw smoke. I heard a roar. Must have been a dragon guarding it. Boom. Myth born. Also, taxes avoided. The obsession with dragon treasure wasn't just literary. It influenced real behavior. Knights claimed to go on quests not just for glory, but with the unspoken hope of stumbling across a dragon lair and its loot. Pilgrims bought dubious maps marked with X's and warnings in Latin. Caverna Draconis, the Cave of the Dragon. It was a gamble, spiritual enlightenment, or flame-broiled death. Quirkier still, some churches owned items said to come from dragon hoards. Golden chalices, gem-studded reliquaries, odd relics with no clear origin. Their backstory recovered after the slaying of the beast. Very little verification, but the story helped with tithes. In medieval art, hoarding, dragons were often portrayed lying atop impossible piles of treasure, like a scaly Scrooge McDuck. Scrolls, swords, crowns all gleaming in the torchlight, and the dragon always watchful, its eyes open even in sleep. You couldn't just sneak up on it. You had to earn that gold with blood and fire, or die trying. But here's the thing. No one ever explained why dragons wanted treasure. They didn't spend it, didn't trade it, didn't even wear it. Imagine a dragon trying to put on rings. Hilarious. They simply kept it, guarded it, obsessed over it, as if the treasure wasn't wealth, but something deeper: identity. The hoard defined the dragon. Without it, it was just another flying lizard. With it, it became legend. It makes you wonder, was the dragon protecting the treasure, or was the treasure protecting the dragon? You drain the last of your drink as the old man beside you begins to snore into his ale. Outside, the night hums with stories. Somewhere, a cave lies quiet beneath the earth, sealed by time and dust. No torchlight flickers, no swords gleam. But deep inside, gold still sleeps under a coiled shadow, and it is watching. You're standing in the echoing courtyard of a crumbling castle, wind threading through arrow slits and ivy-covered stone. Faded flags ripple overhead. A rusted shield leans against the wall, painted with a creature you recognize immediately, a dragon mouth, open tail curling. Not a warning, a statement. This dragon isn't real. It's symbolic, decorative. It belongs to someone. Welcome to the world of medieval heraldry, where dragons weren't just feared, they were bragged about. Nobles, knights, even small-town lords loved putting dragons on their banners. Why? Because it screamed power, control, supernatural menace on your side. You didn't just wear a lion or a boar on your tunic if you wanted to stand out. No, if you wanted whispers in the tavern and second glances in the throne room, you slapped a dragon on your crest and dared anyone to ask where you got it. Of course, most of these lords had never seen a dragon, let alone slain one. But that minor detail never stopped anyone in the Middle Ages from wildly exaggerating. Great-great-grandfather Arthur fought a worm in the Black Marsh. Did he? Maybe. More likely he got kicked by a mule, and someone made up the rest. The most famous example, the Red Dragon of Wales. Still used on the national flag today, the Y Deirdre Goch traces back to ancient Celtic legends, but was fully embraced by medieval Welsh rulers like Cadwallader and later the Tudors. It wasn't just cool looking, it was a symbol of prophecy. According to Geoffrey of Monmouth's wildly popular and wildly fictional Historia Regum Britannia, a red dragon and a white dragon battled beneath Dinas Emrys, symbolizing the struggle between the Welsh and the invading Saxons. Spoiler, the red dragon wins. Of course it does. This kind of mythic framing wasn't unusual. Historians still argue whether dragons in heraldry were ever meant to be taken literally or if they were always metaphors, representations of ferocity, protection, and noble bloodlines. The truth, likely both. In a world where half the population couldn't read, and the other half read very selectively, images mattered. A dragon meant, "Don't mess with me," in every dialect. But it wasn't just red or gold lizards. Heraldry got creative. Some dragons had 2 legs, others 4. Some had wings, some none. Wyverns, 2-legged winged dragons, became especially popular in English coats of arms, seen as sleeker, more elegant, and easier to embroider, always a bonus. Then there were basilisk dragons, hydras, and even cockatrices, rooster-headed abominations with dragon tails. If it could kill you and looked fabulous doing it, someone would paint it on a shield. And not just nobles, merchant guilds, city-states, even taverns adopted dragon imagery. Inns were named the Green Worm or the Dragon's Head to entice travelers or maybe scare off the ones who didn't pay their tabs. Dragons became medieval branding, like a neon sign but with scales. Quirky tidbit. Some nobles invented entire fake dragon-slaying ancestries just to gain prestige. Imagine claiming your great-grandmother's second husband's cousin once wounded a dragon outside Normandy, and that's why your family deserves a better dowry. It sounds absurd, but these tales stuck especially when written down by a friendly monk paid in meat pies. Even the church got in on the act. While dragons were usually seen as satanic, in theology, some religious orders used tamed dragons in their symbolism, meant to show dominance over evil. You'd find stained glass depictions of saints standing over subdued dragons, not always slaying them, but controlling them. A nice reminder that not all dragons needed a sword to the neck, some just needed a sermon. Of course not, and everyone was impressed. A few chroniclers, particularly the more scholarly types, rolled their eyes at nobles flaunting dragon sigils. You wear the beast, but run from your own debts. One monk wrote in a letter to a baron who allegedly fled battle. Monastic burns were real. Still, the dragon's grip on imagination held firm. By the 14th century, tournaments featured knights dressed in full dragon regalia, plumed helms, scaled cloaks, fire breath props, unsafe but impressive. A knight wearing a dragon didn't need to boast. The armor boasted for him. And perhaps that's the point. In a world filled with uncertainty, war, famine, and plague, the dragon became more than a monster. It was a mirror of power, of courage, of who you wanted to be. Real or not, it stood for something you could claim even if only stitched into your surcoat. Now you step away from the crumbling shield. The paint is faded, but the dragon still grins through the centuries. Not because it was slain, but because someone somewhere wanted you to remember it. You finally made it to a monastery tucked deep in the hills, the kind with too many stairs, too few cushions, and an unmistakable musty air of divinely inspired mildew. The scriptorium is hushed monks hunched over desks like turtles in brown robes, pens scratching away at parchment that's older than your boots. But if you ask politely and maybe offer to sweep the cloisters, they'll show you what they keep in the cellar. Dragon bones. Well, they say dragon bones. What they're actually showing you is a collection of massive, yellowed skeleton parts, ribs, the size of scythes' femurs, like small trees and skulls that look suspiciously like they belong to something extinct and herbivorous. Still, the monks call them ossa draconis, and they guard them with the same solemnity you'd expect from holy relics, which to them they are. This wasn't uncommon. Across Europe, churches, abbeys, and local shrines proudly displayed what they claimed were dragon remains. Some were suspended from ceilings. Others were sealed in glass cases. A few lucky villagers even had dragon teeth passed down like family heirlooms. Usually whale teeth, bear fangs, or the occasional unfortunate elephant molar. To medieval folks, it didn't matter that these bones didn't quite match the illustrations in their bestiaries. The scale, huge. The shape, weird. The smell, faintly like damp legend. Good enough. Science didn't have much sway when the local bishop was telling you that this tibia came from a dragon slain by Saint Mercurius in 834 AD. You didn't question the relic. You bowed and maybe made a small donation. Historians still argue whether these bones were intentional fabrications or honest misidentifications. Remember, this was a time before paleontology, before dinosaur fossils were anything but ominous rocks poking out of cliff faces. A woolly rhinoceros skull found in the Carpathians' dragon, a mastodon femur in a riverbank dragon, a particularly large sturgeon pulled from the Rhine. You guessed it, river dragon. Quirky side note, one church in Austria actually had a dragon skull hanging in its nave that turned out to be the jawbone of a Pleistocene cave bear. For centuries, locals swore it belonged to a winged terror that once plagued the mountains and was slain by a long-dead knight. When scientists finally tested it, they discovered the truth, but by then no one wanted the truth. The legend had already paid for a new roof and half a dozen stained glass windows. And it wasn't just bones. Some monasteries kept dragon scales, or so they claimed. These were usually fossilized fish scales, bits of crocodile hide or dried pangolin plates from distant lands gifted by traders who'd been told exactly what the monks wanted to hear. A few even had dragon eggs, which were likely geodes, petrified sea urchins, or very unlucky coconuts. You have to admire the confidence. When confronted with the unexplained, medieval minds didn't say, "We don't know." They said, "Obviously a dragon," and then wrote it in Latin for emphasis. Even more fascinating is how these bones were used. They weren't just showpieces, they had purpose. Powdered dragon bone was sold as a remedy for fever, epilepsy, and heartbreak. Priests might crush a bit into holy water for extra spiritual punch. A knight might carry a sliver into battle, hoping it'd deflect arrows. Apothecaries labeled them Ossibus draconis and sold them beside dried mandrake and bottled moonlight. You'd think someone would catch on eventually. But even when naturalists in the later Middle Ages began quietly questioning the authenticity, the public sentiment didn't budge. People believed in dragons because they wanted to. The bones made the danger and the victory real, tangible proof that the world was filled with monstrous beauty and that sometimes, just sometimes good, had triumphed over it. Even kings got in on it. Charlemagne supposedly kept a dragon horn gifted to him by an Arab ruler, probably a narwhal tusk, but who's checking? And in Krakow, Poland, the Wawel Cathedral proudly displayed the bones of the Wawel dragon, which turned out to be from a mix of whale and rhino. Did it matter? Not one bit. Tourists still flocked there 700 years later. You descend into the cellar now. Dust floats in golden shafts of candlelight. The monk ahead of you pulls back a linen cloth, revealing the long curved rib of something very large. He nods. Draco, he says. And in that moment, despite everything you know, you believe him. Because the world, after all, is a little more thrilling when dragons once walked it. The sky is darkening now, not from twilight, but from something heavier, clouds stacking like stone. On stone was tugging at your cloak like an urgent child. You glance up, and for a heartbeat, the sun disappears behind a thick, rolling shadow. In the Middle Ages, this wasn't just weather, this was warning. Because when the storm came, when thunder cracked and lightning danced across the sky, it meant only one thing: a dragon was flying overhead. Welcome to the age-old superstition of weather dragons, beasts, not bound to earth or cave, but swirling above the clouds, cloaked in storm and fury. In a time before meteorology, it made sense. How else to explain something as sudden and violent as lightning, as loud as thunder, as merciless as hail? People looked skyward and didn't just see clouds. They saw wings, furious, invisible wings. In medieval German folklore, there was the Wetterdruck, or weather dragon, believed to bring storms when angered. If crops failed or lightning struck a church steeple, locals would say the dragon was disturbed, usually by someone sinning too loudly or forgetting a tithe. These dragons weren't necessarily evil. They were more like cosmic janitors with short tempers. Disrespect the balance, and they'd come wash it all away with windfire and regret. In Slavic traditions, similar beliefs appeared in tales of flying serpents that ate the moon during eclipses or caused storms when jealous of human celebrations. Did your harvest festival get rained out? Must have been a sky dragon sulking over not being invited. Next time, leave out some bread and maybe a small wine jug. Hospitality matters even with airborne monsters. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were metaphorical representations of divine wrath or literal interpretations of natural phenomena. Some suggest that thunder dragons were an easy way to explain unpredictable summer storms, especially in regions where lightning frequently struck isolated churches or barns. Others see it as a holdover from older pagan sky deities, slowly rebranded by the church as dangerous beasts rather than divine beings. But not all sky dragons were angry. In some regions, they were helpful if a bit terrifying. A few Bavarian folk tales speak of dragons that flew overhead in specific patterns to signal good luck or coming rain after drought. One 14th century farmer's diary notes that a long black shadow passed the sun, and within 2 days the barley returned. Coincidence? Maybe. Dragon, definitely maybe. And then there were the firestorms. Certain legends describe dragons igniting the air itself, raining fire down on forests or villages. Today, we'd blame dry conditions, lightning, or a careless lantern. But in the medieval imagination, fire from the sky could only come from something living up there, and extremely angry. A winged flamethrower throwing a tantrum in the clouds. You might be tempted to laugh, but think of the sensory experience. You're in a wooden house, no insulation, no weather alerts. The sky roars, a bolt of light splits a tree in half outside your door. The air smells of burnt earth and fear, and then the rain lashes down so hard it feels like the sky itself is cracking. You don't just hear a storm, you feel hunted. A dragon. Honestly, that's one of the more comforting explanations. Quirky twist. Some monks believe dragons nested in the clouds. That's right, invisible floating caves hidden in thunderheads where they slept, hatched eggs, and occasionally fell. One account from a monastery near Milan in the 1200s describes a sky beast crashing into a field during a windstorm. No body was ever found, of course, but a suspiciously large crater remained, and the tale was copied by 3 other monasteries within the decade. Proof enough in medieval terms. There were also charmingly bizarre rituals to ward off weather dragons. Ringing church bells was a common one, not just to summon villagers, but to scare the beast away. In fact, some bells were blessed specifically for this purpose, their bronze tones believed to disrupt the dragon's flight path. If the bell cracked, that meant it had worked. A noble sacrifice, another ritual burning bundles of herbs at crossroads while chanting the Lord's Prayer backwards. Yes, backwards. Which absolutely nobody did correctly, but points for effort. And if that failed, people might draw protective symbols on their door frames, often depicting a cross overlaid with something suspiciously serpentine, as if saying, "Yes, we see you. No, you may not come in." There's even a fringe theory among modern scholars that some medieval sightings of sky dragons were actually meteors or comet fragments. Those sudden flaming streaks across the sky that seem to roar with speed and vanish before you can explain them. A dragon's tail easily, a heavenly omen always. You tilt your head now, watching those same clouds build above you. A gust of wind rattles the treetops. A flicker of lightning dances across the horizon, and for a split second, in the silence before thunder answers, you almost think you hear it, a low growl deep and distant, circling high above. Just the storm, you tell yourself. Probably. You wake in the night to a bitter wind sweeping through the shutters. The air is heavy, stale, tinged with something you can't quite place. Rot ash. You sit up, and someone coughs in the next room. Another groan echoes down the hall. The villagers say it's the fever, the bad air. But the priest, he warns of something darker. He says the dragon has breathed here. In medieval Europe, dragons didn't just burn down villages. They brought something worse: plague, famine, pestilence. These weren't just side effects. They were the dragon's real weapons. Because a beast that breathes fire is scary, sure, but one whose very breath brings disease. Now that's legendary. People truly believed that dragons were the invisible agents of illness. If crops failed, if cattle died, if people dropped with sweating sickness, someone would murmur, "A dragon passed this way," especially when no one could see it. The idea of an unseen dragon, a spirit beast made of air and poison, fit perfectly into a world already straining to explain why everything smelled vaguely like despair. One famous example, the Black Death. While modern science chalks it up to Yersinia pestis and a tragic case of rat-based bad luck, many at the time blamed dragons. Not necessarily roaming fire breathers, but aerial dragon's beasts that flew high in the upper atmosphere, invisible to the eye, but toxic in their passage. Some said their breath turned the sky red. Others claimed the plague clouds were their wing trails laced with divine punishment and soot. In a 14th century Flemish text, an anonymous monk wrote that the dragon's eye was upon the towns, and that sickness followed wherever its gaze lingered. A poetic flourish, perhaps, but it stuck. As the death toll mounted, so too did the dragon stories. Some claimed to see serpentine shapes curling in the clouds. Others swore they'd heard growls in the wind just before entire villages fell silent. Historians still argue whether this belief was genuine or symbolic, an effort to personify catastrophe into something you could at least name. You couldn't stab a miasma, but a dragon that in theory you could chase away with Bel's prayers, or if all else failed, a really aggressive procession. Quirkier still was the idea that certain herbs could repel a pestilence dragon. Sage yarrow and garlic were often hung in bundles from rafters or doorposts, not just for their smell or supposed healing properties, but because they confused the beast. Some recipes even called for a blend of vinegar and rose petals to be sprinkled along windowsills like holy water, but sassier. The dragon as plague bringer wasn't confined to illness alone. Crop failure. The dragon had scorched the roots with its invisible fire, a sickly baby. The dragon passed too close to the cradle. A string of bad luck. Clearly the dragon was offended by what no one knew. But just in case, better leave out a bowl of milk near the fireplace and whisper an apology at dusk. There's one particularly strange account from the city of Lübeck in the 13th century. A dragon wind was said to have blown in from the sea, wilting plants overnight and giving the cows slack eyes. The bishop declared a fast. The merchants blamed a rival city, and one man insisted he'd seen the beast itself, no bigger than a horse with wings like wet sails and breath that stank of old meat and grave soil. He was promptly ignored until his house burned down a week later. Coincidence? Of course not. Dragons love revenge. The church walked a fine line on these stories. On one hand, they preferred to explain pestilence as divine punishment for sin. On the other, blaming dragons, agents of Satan, after all, gave them a useful scapegoat. That way, the sermon could include both repent or the dragon will return, motivational and terrifying. In some places, people believed the only way to stop a plague dragon was through loud noise. That's why during outbreaks, you'd hear clanging pans, wailing horns, and desperate drumming. The idea was to chase the dragon from the air like a badly behaved stork. In one Austrian village, this ritual became an annual event, even when no illness struck. Just in case, the dragon was thinking about dropping by. Modern scholars have tried to track the evolution of this belief. Some point to volcanic eruptions or comet sightings, natural disasters that poisoned the sky and seeded panic. Others blame translations, gone rogue, ancient texts referring to pestilent vapors were reimagined by frightened monks as draconian breath. One particularly enthusiastic friar even claimed to smell sulfur before every death in his abbey and wrote extensively about dragons curdling the air like spoiled milk. Dramatic, absolutely. Effective, well, he was the last one left alive, so maybe. And you here in the dark feel the chill of the wind against your cheek. You tell yourself it's just a breeze, that the coughing down the hall is nothing, that the smell is just damp wood and old straw. But still you glance toward the window, not because you expect to see wings, but because part of you, the part that doesn't quite trust daylight anymore, wonders. What if the dragon isn't fire at all? What if it's sickness with scales? You sit now at a wooden desk oil lamp flickering beside you, fingers stained with ink. You've been flipping through a bestiary, an illuminated manuscript so old it creaks when you breathe near it. And there it is, right between the unicorn and the hedgehog, a dragon, bright red, curled like a pretzel, breathing fire on a very confused-looking ox. This apparently is science. Welcome to the world of medieval bestiaries where dragons were not just legends, they were indexable, categorized, illuminated, explained with the same scholarly tone you'd use to describe a sheep or the mating habits of the barn owl. And make no mistake, dragons were always in there. Always. Bestiaries were part encyclopedia, part moral sermon, and part fever dream. Compiled by monks and scribes, they attempted to catalog every known and imagined creature in God's creation. Animals were described in careful, pseudo-scientific detail, habits, habitats, dietary preferences, and then paired with a moral lesson. The lion represented Christ. The ant diligence. The pelican, oddly enough, was thought to wound itself to feed its chicks, blood symbolizing self-sacrifice. And the dragon, oh the dragon, had layers. One popular entry went like this: the dragon is the greatest of all serpents and of all living things upon the earth. It is born in Ethiopia and India. It guards treasure. Its breath burns. Its body is long and its heart filled with malice. Followed immediately by the dragon is the devil. So there you have it. Field guide meets exorcism. The illustrations varied wildly. Some showed dragons as giant snakes, others as bulky lizards, with ears and unfortunate haircuts. Some looked like geese, with anger issues. Their expressions ranged from comically bored to existentially furious. Many were pictured tangled around trees, biting their own tails. That wasn't a mistake. It symbolized eternity, or sin consuming itself, depending on how poetic the monk was feeling that day. Historians still argue about the purpose of bestiaries. Were they educational tools, sermon props? A medieval attempt to bring order to a world filled with plague, famine, and creatures with 3 heads and questionable biology? The answer is yes. All of it. A monk might read the dragon entry to teach students about sin. A noble might keep one for entertainment. A traveler might use it to scare off children asking for stories before bed. And let's not pretend these books were rare. Bestiaries were everywhere. They showed up in abbeys, castles, village churches. Rich nobles had them commissioned with gold leaf dragons so shiny they practically roared. Poorer monks copied them on reused parchment, carefully preserving every forked tongue and tiny, terrified sheep. What makes them so fascinating, apart from the occasional rhinoceros, drawn like a lumpy dog, is how confidently they presented nonsense. Dragons, of course, were real as elephants, which they often fought in the margins. That was a common entry, by the way. The dragon is the enemy of the elephant. It lies in wait in trees and drops upon the elephant's back, strangling it with its tail. Very few people in 12th century France had seen an elephant. Even fewer had seen one wrestled by a snake. But the imagery stuck. So did the lessons. The dragon became not just a creature of fantasy, but a tool, a way to teach virtue, a symbol of wrath, greed, pride. Slay the dragon and you slay sin, tame the dragon and you master yourself. Ignore the dragon and you're probably next on its menu. Quirkier still, some bestiaries included subspecies. One English copy from the 13th century lists a green dragon of the northern wastes, likely inspired by Norse tales, a red dragon of the eastern sands, probably poetic license, and even a sleeping dragon beneath the ocean, a theory that reappeared centuries later in literature and, curiously, video games. Medieval influence runs deep. Not all entries were dramatic. Some were oddly specific. One French bestiary noted that dragon dung smells of almonds and should never be touched. No context, just vibes. Others advised how to spot a dragon's lair: scorched trees, dry wells, and a silence among birds. That detail, lifted from a now lost Roman text, became popular shorthand in folklore. No birds. Check the caves. Bring holy water, even the margins. Those delightful little doodles around the text got in on the act. Dragons biting knights, dragons dancing with pigs, dragons wearing crowns and sulking. It was as if the scribes couldn't help themselves. Once you drew one dragon, you had to keep going. They were irresistible. You close the book now. The lamp flickers lower. The dragon on the page stares back, frozen in ink, but somehow alive. You've just spent an hour with a creature no one had ever truly seen, yet everyone knew. That's the power of belief bound in leather and ink. And in the medieval imagination, that made the dragon as real as anything that breathed. The air smells of ash and sweat. You're standing in a half-collapsed amphitheater ringed by torchlight, watching as two armored figures circle each other. One bears a sword, the other a long spear. But they're not facing off against each other. They're both staring toward the great wooden gate at the end of the pit. And behind it, you already know, because you've heard the whispers, there's a dragon in there, and it has one weak spot. Of all the strange and specific details in medieval dragon lore, none captured the imagination quite like the idea that every dragon, no matter how enormous or terrifying, had a single vulnerable spot. And better still, if you were clever or lucky, you could hit it. This wasn't just a storytelling device. It was essential, because without a flaw, dragons were invincible, and that wasn't fun for anyone. Least of all the knight, stuck holding a wooden shield and a prayer. The vulnerable point made the battle a test of skill, not just strength, and it gave the average terrified listener hope. If evil has a soft underbelly, maybe we do stand a chance. So where was it that depended on who you asked? One of the most repeated versions comes from the tale of Sigurd and Fafnir, a Norse saga in which the hero kills the dragon by stabbing it beneath its shoulder where the belly scales are thinnest. Sigurd even digs a trench and lies in wait, stabbing upward as the beast slithers over him. It's clever, it's gross, and it's become the template for dragon weak spots ever since. In other tales, the spot is under the jaw, or behind the eye, or in the armpit, which, let's be honest, is just delightful. A monster with scale-plated wings and burning breath, defeated by a poorly armored pit stain. That's some excellent mythological balance. Historians still argue whether these vulnerable points were just literary devices or reflections of real military logic. After all, knights knew full well that even the most heavily armored man had weak spots at the joints. So it made sense that dragons, no matter how magical, might have similar design flaws. And nothing tickled a medieval audience more than the idea of the small overcoming the mighty with a bit of knowledge and very good aim. There's a quirky fringe theory that these weak spots were inspired by early encounters with fossilized skeletons. A large, strange rib cage eroded away might show a gap, break a hole, and someone might decide, ah yes, that must be where the knight got him. Add a story, add a hero. Now you've got a relic site and a tourism opportunity. Some bestiaries took it a step further, declaring that dragons could only be wounded by blessed weapons. Ordinary steel bounced off, but a sword anointed in holy oil that could pierce the hide. Or if you were in a more practical region, there was always boiling pitch hurled into the mouth as the dragon roared. Tactical disgusting and surprisingly popular in French folklore, but the most legendary weak spot might belong to Smoke Wawelski, the Wawel dragon of Krakow. According to Polish legend, a clever shoemaker stuffed a lamb with sulfur and tar, left it outside the dragon's cave, and waited. The dragon devoured it, grew horribly thirsty, drank half the Vistula River, and then exploded. Weak spot digestion, weakness, gluttony, victory village shoemaker. That story was told, retold, and eventually carved into stone. Today, there's a statue of the dragon near Wawel Castle that breathes real fire. No weak spots there unless it runs out of gas. The idea of dragon vulnerability was not only comforting, it was instructional. Every medieval tale needed a moral, and the moral here was simple. No matter how terrifying the enemy, there's always a way through. It might be skill, it might be faith, it might be waiting for your moment and knowing where to strike. You'd even find weak spots depicted in art. Illuminated manuscripts sometimes showed knights aiming for the dragon's underbelly or slashing toward its neck. A few cheeky illustrations went for the tail, though whether that was strategy or comedy, it's hard to say. And if the dragon didn't have a physical weakness, then it had a moral one. Greed, arrogance, a fondness for riddles, something a clever hero could exploit. In one Byzantine folktale, a dragon is tricked into swallowing a bell tied to a cross. The clanging drives it mad, and it throws itself off a cliff. Not exactly textbook warfare, but effective. You look now at the training yard before you empty, except for a worn practice dummy and a rusting spear. The stories echo in on your head. Aim for the armpit, strike from below, bait it with a sheep, and most importantly, don't blink. Because when the beast comes, there may only be one chance, one weakness, one small opening between scale and shadow, and you'll need to hit it. You follow the twisting path of a stream, its banks overgrown with ferns and wild mint, until you find yourself in a clearing filled with an eerie quiet. No birds, no insects, just a long, winding trail of upturned earth and something slick dragging through the mud. You've stumbled into the territory of a worm, or maybe a worm or a wyvern. Honestly, it's hard to tell, because in the medieval world, not all dragons were created equal. That's right, there wasn't just one kind of dragon. There were types. Subspecies, if you will. A scaly family tree of confusing, overlapping names and wildly different behaviors. You couldn't just say dragon and call it a day. You had to know if you were dealing with a serpent, a flyer, or something that slithered like a very angry garden hose. Start with the worm or worm, depending on the spelling. These were legless dragons, long sinuous, and often wingless. They didn't soar majestically through the clouds. They slid, slowly, silently. Like danger made flesh, you could think of them as the OG land dragons, part snake, part nightmare. And no, not tiny either. Some tales described worms as thick as oak trunks and long enough to wrap around hills. In England, the Lambton worm was one of the most famous of its kind. Said to have been raised accidentally, of course, by a wayward nobleman who tossed a mysterious fish into a well before leaving for the Crusades. When he returned, the worm had grown to enormous size and coiled around a hill eating livestock and people like breath mints. Eventually it was slain, but only after the hero wore armor covered in blades. Smart, messy, highly effective. Then you had the wyvern, usually depicted with 2 legs, 2 wings, and a barbed tail. Sleeker than traditional dragons, wyverns were faster, crueler, and often more poisonous. They were the perfect villain for heraldry and battlefield banners, terrifying but efficient. If a dragon was a tank, the wyvern was a fighter jet with an attitude problem. Historians still argue about the distinctions. The Latin Draco originally referred to a serpent, but by the Middle Ages dragon worm and wyvern had all taken on unique meanings depending on the region, the artist, and how many meads they'd had before drawing. One bestiary might call a dragon 4-footed and winged, while another shows a serpentine worm curled around a saint's sandal. Consistency was not a medieval strong point. Quirky tidbit. Some texts refer to amphipteres, dragons with wings but no legs. Imagine a snake that could fly and now try to sleep again. They were said to roost in trees, drop down on prey, and because this is the Middle Ages, sometimes guard temples in Egypt or gold mines in Spain. Absolutely no evidence for any of that, but it sure made for great fireside gossip. There were also drakes, a more generic, often wingless type of dragon, usually associated with elemental powers. Fire drakes were the most common in tales, but you also had frost drakes, storm drakes, even shadow drakes. These showed up more frequently in later folklore and proto-fantasy tales, but their roots dig deep into medieval imagination. Some believed certain regions bred certain types: mountain drakes, bog worms, forest wyverns. It sounds like a dangerous Pokemon expansion pack, but for 12th century shepherds, this was survival knowledge. Of course, these categories weren't always respected. One monk's worm was another knight's wyvern, and if a scribe didn't like his lord, he might accidentally draw a legless dragon on the family crest, an insult implying weakness, cowardice, or at the very least, bad posture. But people took the differences seriously. You didn't fight a worm the same way you fought a wyvern. Worms didn't fly, so you could trap them. Wyverns. You needed nets and bait, lots of bait, preferably loud, smelly goats. There's an unsettling number of stories where goats are used as disposable dragon snacks. Even the way you died varied. A worm might crush you. A wyvern might sting you with its venomous tail. A drake might just burn down the entire village out of spite. Knowing your dragon type wasn't just folklore, it was field intel. One 13th century dragon hunting guide, probably written with far more confidence than experience, claimed that wyverns shun mirrors, worms hate the smell of iron, and that a drake may be soothed by flute music. No confirmation on whether this worked, but it does explain some of the more bizarre deaths recorded in town ledgers. He played the lute. The beast was unmoved. You kneel now beside the muddy trail in the clearing. The path carved into the earth is too wide for a snake, too smooth for a wagon. No prints, no feathers, just the long, heavy impression of something ancient and slithering. No wings in sight, which means you might just be dealing with a worm. Or worse, a worm that thinks it's a dragon, and those, they're always the hungriest. You're seated on a rough bench in the smoky corner of a tavern where the air is thick with stew, steam, mead breath, and the clatter of dice against wood. Across from you sits a man in dented chainmail boots, caked in something suspicious, and eyes that haven't blinked in too long. He leans in close and says, "It's not about the dragon, it's about the story." And just like that, you've entered the world of knights with a side hustle, because slaying dragons wasn't just about chivalry, it was branding. In medieval Europe, dragons weren't just creatures of myth. They were career opportunities. If you were a knight, or wanted to be a knight, or at least impress someone important with a sword and a favor to grant, you needed a legend. And nothing screamed hero material louder than facing down a flaming, fang-riddled nightmare and surviving long enough to write about it. Even if you didn't actually fight one. Especially if you didn't actually fight one. Slaying a dragon became shorthand for valor. It was the medieval equivalent of going viral. You didn't just kill the beast, you earned a title, a crest, maybe even a castle. Marriages were arranged, songs were sung, and suddenly your name was etched into the corner of every stained glass window from here to Normandy. The return on investment, huge. The risk, debatable. You see, most of these dragon-slaying tales follow a suspiciously similar pattern. A region is plagued by a dragon. Cattle vanish, fields smolder, a noble's daughter is next on the menu. Then just in time, a lone warrior shows up, often foreign, often pious, and definitely handsome. He battles the beast sometimes with holy relics, sometimes with dumb luck, and wins. Town celebrates. Hero marries local royalty or disappears mysteriously, possibly to repeat the process 2 villages over. Historians still argue whether any of these tales were rooted in actual monster hunts, possibly exaggerated encounters with bears, giant pythons, or one very confused crocodile, or if they were always fictional scaffolding to prop up a reputation. Either way, the results were the same dragon equals glory. Quirky twist. Some of these slayers didn't even need to kill the dragon. Just surviving an encounter was enough. A knight might claim he saw a dragon crossed himself and lived to tell the tale, or that he wounded it, chased it off, or better yet, converted it. Yes, there are multiple accounts of dragons being tamed, baptized, or convinced to leave peacefully by especially persuasive holy men. Call it theological pest control. And what about the dragonless regions? Did knights there give up? Of course not. They imported the idea. You'd find statues of dragon-slaying heroes in towns that had never seen so much as a large lizard. Some enterprising nobles even had artists paint them battling dragons just in case their grandchildren wanted to upgrade the family saga later. One famous case, Richard the Lionheart. While he never claimed to fight an actual dragon, his emblem featured one, and his chroniclers weren't shy about comparing his enemies to scaly beasts. It was political theater. The dragon represented chaos, and Richard order, or at least very loud violence in the name of order. Then there were the mercenaries, knights for hire, who traveled from court to court, spinning tales of their deeds. Oh yes, my lady, the scales were harder than iron. Its eyes glowed red as rubies. I wounded it with my blessed dagger and sang it back into the earth. Did they have proof? No. Did anyone care? Also, no. The story was the thing. Even churches cashed in. Saint George, the dragon-slaying saint we met earlier, became so popular that entire orders of knighthood were named after him. Being of the dragon didn't mean you served one, it meant you'd beaten one, or at least aligned yourself with someone who did. Christian dragon-slaying PR was immaculate. There's also the question of armor upgrades. Several knightly tales mention reforging their weapons or armor after slaying a dragon, infused with its blood, its scales, or its spirit. While no such materials exist in reality, unless you count forged crocodile leather, the legend persisted. A blade that killed a dragon. Worth 10 normal swords, and infinitely more poetic. You begin to see the pattern. In a world where fame and survival often depended on who was telling your story, dragons became the ultimate resume line. Didn't matter if the beast was real or allegorical. What mattered was that you faced it and won, or said you did. Because in the end, the dragon wasn't just an obstacle, it was a narrative device, a test, a spotlight, and for the right knight with the right story, it was the beginning of everything. You find yourself walking past a crumbling village on the edge of a forgotten forest. The thatched roofs sag like tired shoulders, and a lone shepherd eyes you from the path, clutching a lamb that's just a little too quiet. He leans closer and whispers, "You know, sometimes they still eat people." Then he turns away, and you're left with the weight of that sentence hanging in the dusk like a shadow, too scared to fall. It's time to ask the obvious and very medieval question: did dragons eat people? Short answer, yes. Long answer, absolutely frequently, and often with specific culinary preferences. To the medieval imagination, dragons weren't just symbolic monsters, they were predators, big ones, with the appetites to match. And while sheep oxen and unlucky goats often topped the menu, humans were never off the table, especially if they were young royal or morally ambiguous. Dragons, after all, didn't just kill, they devoured. It was part of what made them monstrous. The ultimate sin. The ultimate fear being consumed, whole lost forever, in a belly that belched smoke and smelled of cooked innocence. Take the St. George legend again. Before George showed up, the dragon in that town had already eaten a healthy supply of livestock and several unfortunate citizens, usually maidens, which tells you more about storytelling patterns than zoology. When the princess was chosen next, it wasn't a surprise. It was just her turn, and she wouldn't be the last. In Norse sagas, the dragon Fafnir didn't just guard treasure, he also threatened to wipe out anyone who got too close. Did he eat them? Probably. Dragons aren't known for their hospitality. In other legends, dragons didn't merely eat people they demanded them, as tribute, as punishment, as very dramatic metaphors for taxation. Historians still argue whether this aspect of dragon lore reflects cannibalistic folk fears, or whether it's a grim personification of plague and death. In regions with a history of famine, the idea of being eaten by something large and unstoppable felt very real. Dragons became walking disasters, capable of consuming not just people, but entire communities socially, spiritually, and yes, literally. And let's not forget the dragons who got picky. Some tales insisted dragons only ate virgins. Others said they only ate sinners. A few more practical ones claimed dragons simply ate whoever was slowest to run. One Byzantine legend even describes a dragon that refused to eat monks because they tasted like ash. You have to admire the creativity and the theological sass. Quirky side note, there were medieval recipes seriously that claimed to cure the effects of being dragon-touched, as in someone almost eaten but managed to escape. Symptoms included burns, hallucinations, and an overwhelming urge to scream at shadows. The cure, a mix of garlic, crushed rose petals, and powdered gall from a lion's liver. Hard to find on short notice, but points for effort. Some stories get more detailed, uncomfortably so. A 13th century English tale describes a dragon who would roast its victims in a blast of fire, then use its tail to sling the crispier bits into its mouth. Another suggests dragons didn't chew, but swallowed prey whole and digested them over days. It's horrifying. It's absurd. It's exactly the kind of nightmare that flourishes in oral tradition. But it wasn't always about hunger. Sometimes dragons ate people out of spite, out of pride, out of boredom. One French tale tells of a knight who tried to outwit a dragon with riddles. The dragon got the first two wrong. On the third, it didn't even answer. It just ate him. Fair play. And occasionally, a dragon's appetite backfired. A few stories feature heroes hiding sharp objects Swords poison thorns on their bodies before being eaten. Once inside, they'd slice their way out like extremely determined gallstones. Was it gruesome? Absolutely. Was it popular? Definitely. People loved the idea that you could beat the beast from within. Very on brand for medieval resilience. There were even reports, purely anecdotal, of course, of dragons eating too much and dying of indigestion. In the Austrian Alps, one folk tale warns that the beast gorged upon cattle and men alike until its belly split and the birds picked its bones, which it honestly sounds like karma with feathers. Yet for all their monstrous appetite, dragons weren't always portrayed as ravenous beasts. Some were majestic, reserved above the messiness of chewing on peasants. But those were rare. More often, the dragon in your village was hungry, and if the wind smelled of sulfur and the sheep started disappearing, people started locking their doors and looking very nervously at their more expendable neighbors. You glance around now, the clearing darker than before. No sound but the creak of branches and your own uneasy breath. You're not a princess, you're not a knight, but still you wonder, if something were watching you from the trees, would you be its type? You're standing in a candlelit chamber that smells of ink iron and just a hint of something burnt. Shelves line the walls, cluttered with vials, twisted glass tubes, and scrolls that crackle when unrolled. In the center, a table. On the table, a drawing, a dragon coiled around a circle tail in its mouth. But this dragon isn't about fire or flight. This one is made of alchemy. Welcome to the secretive and occasionally explosive world of alchemical dragons, where medieval scholars, part scientists, part sorcerers, used the image of the dragon to represent the most dangerous and mysterious forces in nature. Here, the dragon wasn't a beast to be slain, it was a process to be understood. In alchemical texts, dragons symbolized transformation, power, the raw, untamed force at the heart of every experiment. The prima materia, the base substance from which all things could be created, destroyed, or remade. And while most alchemists had never seen a dragon, they felt its presence every time something hissed, boiled over, or unexpectedly exploded in their lab. One of the most famous symbols in alchemy was the Ouroboros, a serpent or dragon, eating its own tail, forming a perfect circle. It represented the cycle of death and rebirth, decay and regeneration, the eternal process of turning lead into gold or base soul into pure spirit. To a medieval mind steeped in mysticism and metaphor, the dragon wasn't a monster. It was truth wrapped in scales. Historians still argue whether these dragons were inspired by Eastern philosophy, Greco-Egyptian symbols, or simply the universal human tendency to fear snakes with ambitions. What's clear is that by the 12th century, the dragon had slithered out of the forest and into the laboratory. In some manuscripts, you'll find references to the green dragon or the red dragon. These weren't literal beasts, they were chemical substances. The green dragon was sometimes sulfuric acid, capable of dissolving metals. The red dragon might be a volatile compound or a symbol of the final stage in the magnum opus, the great work. The terminology was coded esoteric and intentionally opaque. After all, you didn't want just anyone stealing your secrets or setting themselves on fire. Quirkier still, alchemists believed that taming the dragon, controlling its wild energy, was essential to achieving spiritual enlightenment. You weren't just making gold, you were purifying yourself. The dragon lived within you, they said, and only by enduring its fire could you emerge transformed. This wasn't chemistry, it was theology with side effects. Many of these ideas were passed around in lapidaries' manuals that mixed chemical recipes with astrological charts, mystical diagrams, and dragons in every other margin. Some books even described imaginary ingredients like dragon's blood, often a resin from the Dracaena tree, but treated with the same reverence you'd give a unicorn horn or phoenix feather. There's one alchemical tale, possibly apocryphal, definitely dramatic, about a German monk who claimed to have bottled a dragon. What he probably captured was flammable gas from a bog, but according to his notes, he sealed it in a glass sphere, marked it with holy runes, and said it would reveal the soul of the world when heated. He never published a follow-up, presumably because he was launched into the rafters. Even in art, alchemical dragons often took on surreal forms, double-headed, wingless, wrapped around flasks or crucibles. They represented the struggle between matter and spirit, the battle of opposites. Fire and water, earth and air, life and death. You weren't just fighting the dragon, you were the dragon. And you had to understand yourself to master the process. Of course, not all dragons in alchemy were friendly metaphors. Some were warnings. One text includes a diagram of a sleeping dragon beneath a distillation apparatus with the note, "Do not wake this beast unless you have confessed your sins," which in laboratory terms means this thing might explode. And it wasn't just cloistered monks messing around. Royal courts across Europe sponsored alchemists hoping for gold and immortality, or at the very least something useful to throw at the French. Kings and queens consulted dragon-riddled diagrams and funded dragon-named concoctions. One court even named its secret intelligence guild the Red Serpent. Subtle, not especially, but very on-brand. You lean now over the alchemist's table, eyes drawn to the curling script and the little inked dragon coiled at the base of the page. The instructions read, "Combine equal parts courage and curiosity. Stir until the smoke forms a ring. Listen closely. The dragon speaks only once. You don't understand it, but you believe it, because in the glowing coals of every crucible, in the hiss of metal meeting fire in the curling tendrils of unknown fumes, the dragon still waits. And it always wants to teach you something. You're walking through the shadowed nave of a great stone cathedral, boots clicking quietly on the cold floor. Pillars rise like tree trunks into the gloom, and above, stretching across arches and alcoves, you see them. Dragons. Not just one, dozens. Carved into cornices, curled around saints, twisted into the hinges of ancient doors. This place is holy, solemn, divine, and yet it's full of monsters. Welcome to the world of church dragons, where art, architecture, and faith collided in ways both unsettling and strangely beautiful. In medieval Europe, dragons didn't just appear in forests and far-flung stories. They showed up in the safest places in the spaces meant to protect you from evil. And they weren't just hiding in the margins, they were front and center, sculpted, painted, woven into the very bones of the building. It was as if the church had decided, yes, we must include the beast, but only if we put it where everyone can see it being smited. You'd find dragons at the feet of saints in stained glass, being trampled by angels on wooden altars, or spitting fire around the frames of holy manuscripts. Always present, always underfoot, always defeated, this wasn't an accident. The dragon, after all, was a walking allegory. In Christian symbolism, it represented the devil heresy, temptation chaos, and every other uncomfortable thing your priest didn't want to explain directly to children. What better way to demonstrate God's power than to have him or his servants step on a dragon every few feet? The most iconic image, St. Michael's sword raised wings, outstretched, standing on the back of a shrieking dragon, sometimes with glowing eyes, sometimes with 3 heads, always with excellent drama. It wasn't just art. It was spiritual instruction. Evil exists, but it can be conquered by faith, by force, preferably both. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of dragons in church decor was purely theological or a clever way to repurpose fear. People already believed in dragons. They feared them. So the church, rather than dismiss the idea, adopted it, embraced it, gave it a role, just not a winning one. But not all dragons in sacred art were being defeated. In certain Romanesque carvings, especially around the edges of older abbeys and cloisters, dragons appear alone, sometimes devouring sinners, sometimes simply existing wings, tucked heads bowed, curling quietly in stone corners. Were these warnings or reminders, or something older slipping through? One particularly quirky example is a gargoyle on a French cathedral that depicts a dragon laughing, not snarling, not writhing, laughing with its tongue out and its tail curled like a cat's. It sits above a chapel door. The message is unclear. Maybe it's mocking sin. Maybe it's just having a good time. Either way, it's been chuckling for over 800 years. Then there are the roof bosses, those small carved figures found at the intersections of vaulting in medieval churches. In Exeter Cathedral alone, several dragons appear. One chews on a bishop's crozier, another plays what looks suspiciously like a bagpipe. Were these jokes Easter eggs from tired stonemasons, or reflections of a worldview, or even dragons were part of creation? However chaotic, quirkier still are. The labyrinth dragon symbols etched into floor tiles that hinted at spiritual journeys, where the pilgrim's soul, like the knight, must navigate trials, slay dragons, and reach the center reborn. These weren't monsters to kill necessarily, but parts of the journey to understand. Even more intriguing are the so-called green men foliate faces carved into choir stalls and capitals often surrounded by vines, sometimes flanked by serpentine creatures. Some scholars think these reflect older pagan traditions, nature spirits and dragon beasts woven into Christian spaces like camouflage, not erased, just tamed, or at least rebranded, and the manuscripts don't even start. Open a medieval Bible, and odds are you'll find a tiny dragon curled in the corner, sometimes menacing, sometimes sleepy, occasionally being poked by a monk with a stick. Marginalia was medieval meme culture, and dragons were everywhere in the margins, snacking on letters, chasing knights, and occasionally napping next to Jesus. The theology got weird at the edges. But even with all this imagery, the core message stayed consistent. The dragon is dangerous, yes, but also manageable. It can be fought, beaten, transformed into a symbol of triumph. By painting it into the walls and carving it into stone, the church didn't just acknowledge fear, it domesticated it. You stand now in the center of the cathedral, the great rose window casting rainbow shadows across the floor. Above you, St. George drives his lance into a dragon's heart. The stone is cracked, but the image remains. The beast is pinned. The night is calm. And you for a moment believe that all your monsters can be named, and named monsters, after all, can be defeated. The dream begins like this. You're walking alone through a darkened forest, the moon casting silver pools across the leaves. The air is still, too still, and then you see it a shape between the trees, massive scaled and watching. You try to run, but your legs won't move. Its eyes glow, its breath is hot, and just before it speaks, you wake up, sweating, shaking, convinced for a heartbeat that something real followed you back. In the medieval world, dreams weren't just subconscious static. They were messages, prophecies, warnings. And if a dragon appeared in your dreams, oh, you paid attention. To a medieval mind, the appearance of a dragon in sleep meant that something immense was at stake. Maybe it was a personal trial, maybe a political upheaval, maybe your soul hanging in the balance. Dragons in dreams were rarely friendly. They represented sin, temptation, fate, and on special occasions, divine revelation in very angry costume. In some monastic texts, a dragon appearing in a dream signified that the dreamer was being tested. One 12th century manuscript from York details a monk who dreamt of a dragon devouring his monastery. He interpreted it as a warning to abandon pride, which he did. For about 3 days. Then he apparently returned to hoarding cheese. The dream came again, so did the repentance. It became a cycle. Historians still argue whether these dream dragons were purely symbolic or believed to be literal visitations, spiritual entities sent by God or Satan to probe the soul. Many chroniclers treat them with solemnity, recording dragon dreams like court testimonies. Brother Anselm dreamt of the red worm 3 nights in a row. On the 4th, he was found at prayer weeping. There's no punchline, just awe and fear. Some dragons, especially in noble circles, were seen as omens. A knight dreaming of a golden dragon might interpret it as a sign of impending glory or an urgent need to repent. The context mattered. Was the dragon speaking, flying, guarding, treasure, laughing? Yes. Dragon laughter in dreams was considered deeply concerning. It usually meant death, or taxes, or both. And then there were the nightmares, the kind peasants whispered about over shared loaves, tales of entire families plagued by dreams of dragons circling their homes, of children who screamed at night, claiming to see fire in the corner of their room, of dogs that howled at empty doorways. When livestock began to die, the village didn't call a vet. They called the priest. and sometimes, just sometimes, they chalked a protective symbol above the bed. A drake mark. 4 lines. 1 loop. Just in case. One quirkier tradition held that if you dreamt of riding a dragon, it meant your ambitions had outgrown your soul. Another said that being eaten by a dragon in a dream was a sign of spiritual renewal if you survived the digestion. Interpretations varied widely. A Flemish bishop once wrote that dreaming of a dragon in a rose garden was a sign of forbidden love. Another abbot insisted it meant gout. Your mileage may vary. And what about saints? Oh, they dreamed of dragons constantly. In hagiographies, dragons appeared to the pious in dreams to tempt to frighten or sometimes to plead for release, imprisoned souls in reptilian form. One saint reportedly spoke to a weeping dragon who begged to be exorcised. The saint obliged, and the dream ended. The next morning, she awoke to find claw marks on her cell wall. Coincidence? Faith says no, even kings weren't spared. A French chronicle describes how King Philip IV dreamt of a dragon perched atop his crown, breathing smoke into his ears. He ordered a week of fasting afterward and banned roasted meats for a month. Did it help? Not really. He still went to war and things went predictably sideways. Quirky detail dream manuals from the 13th and 14th centuries often included dragon entries sandwiched between dreams of rivers' weddings and teeth falling out. If you dreamt of a black dragon, one guide warned, expect betrayal. A white dragon foretold a journey. A green dragon, pregnancy. No explanation offered, just vibes. Some alchemists even recorded their dragon dreams, interpreting them as symbols of internal transformation. A dragon sleeping beneath the floorboards was seen as the unconscious mind. A dragon flying away, enlightenment. A dragon whispering secrets. Probably lead poisoning, but also maybe an invitation to try again. Today, we talk about dreams with skepticism, Freud and perhaps a little too much coffee. But in the medieval imagination, dreams were maps. And the dragon. It was the borderland beast guarding the gate between waking and wonder. To dream of a dragon was to be invited to risk understanding something larger than yourself. You lie back now in your own quiet room. The light is soft. The wind stirs the curtain. Somewhere outside, a branch creaks just wrong. You close your eyes. And in that moment, just before sleep, you wonder if you dream of a dragon tonight. Will it mean something, or will it mean everything? The fire crackles low in the hearth, throwing flickering shadows across the stone walls. A bundle of dried herbs hangs from the ceiling, swaying gently in the draft. In the corner, a withered old woman stirs something thick and steaming in a blackened pot. You ask her what it is, and she smiles with 3 teeth and says dragon's blood. For the joints, you laugh. She doesn't. Welcome to the surprisingly crowded shelf of dragon-based cures. In the medieval world, dragons weren't just creatures to fear or slay. They were pharmacies. Mobile, fire-breathing, slightly bitey apothecaries. Every part of the dragon, real or imagined, was believed to have some kind of magical, medicinal, or spiritual use. If you were brave or lucky enough to come across a dead one, congratulations. You just found the medieval equivalent of a health food store crossed with an arms dealer. Start with the most prized substance, dragon's blood. Of course, not actual blood, usually. Sometimes it was a resin from the Dracaena tree, bright red and sticky, used in everything from dyes to incense to toothache remedies. But if you lived in a remote village and your neighbor sold you a vial of true dragon blood, you didn't ask too many questions. You dabbed it on your boils and hoped for the best. Real or not, dragon's blood was said to cure just about anything: fever, infection, gout, baldness, infidelity. The last one was questionable, but at least you smelled interesting. Some physicians even prescribed it as an aphrodisiac, because nothing says romance like a few drops of mythical monster juice behind the ears. Then there were the bones. Powdered dragon bone was sold in markets across Europe, often ground from large, unidentifiable fossils, usually mammoth or whale. These powders were mixed into broths sprinkled over wounds or carried in pouches as protection against sickness, bad dreams, and evil speech, which sounds like medieval Twitter. The teeth, ground to a fine dust and baked into pastries for strength. The eyes, said to cure blindness, though no one seemed to have access to a spare. The heart, a powerful talisman, sometimes split into slivers and worn around the neck by warriors and kings. And the gallbladder, boiled into a greenish soup, believed to cure cowardice. Side effects may have included vomiting and immediate regrets. Historians still argue whether any of this was based on real pharmacological effects or simply the power of belief. After all, if you think you've ingested a bit of something that once breathed fire, maybe your back does feel better. Placebo, sure. But mythic placebo, quirky twist. Some recipes insisted the dragon must die of natural causes for its parts to retain full potency. A dragon slain in combat was angry and therefore poisonous. A dragon that died peacefully in its lair after a long life of hoarding gold and avoiding trouble, perfectly mellow medicinal profile, aged like fine wine or fermented goat milk. In magical texts, dragons also featured in potions for truth-telling, invisibility, and even flight. The wings, of course, were essential here, dried, crushed, and boiled with silver leaf under a full moon. The results were inconsistent, but at least they looked dramatic. Dragon parts weren't only used on people either. In certain agricultural traditions, placing a shard of dragon claw, usually a twisted root or curved bone in the center of a field, was believed to bless the soil and keep pests away. Some farmers even nailed dragon scales to barn doors to ward off storms. Again, these were typically pieces of fish or lizard skin, but it's the thought that counts. Then there's the spiritual side. Monks sometimes used dragon's breath as incense during exorcisms, often a mix of aromatic resins and herbs with just enough sulfur to make your eyes water and demons think twice. One obscure rite involved drawing a dragon sigil in ash on the floor and standing in it while praying for protection. It may not have worked, but it looked incredibly cool. But perhaps the strangest dragon cure wasn't meant for the body, but the heart. Several folk traditions claimed that carrying a fragment of dragon bone would protect you from heartbreak, that it would steady the spirit and cool the fever of longing. Love. Potions brewed with Drake's tears, which were really just salt water and violet extract, were sipped slowly under moonlight, the drinker whispering the name of the one they wanted. Results varied. Occasionally they got the lover. More often they got a stomachache and a solid cautionary tale. Modern scholars, of course, shake their heads. None of it holds up to scrutiny. But medieval folks didn't live in laboratories. They lived in valleys with howling winds, bad bread, and sudden sickness. And if someone told you that the scale of a dragon would keep your baby safe through winter, or that drinking dragon bone tea would give you courage before battle, you didn't question it. You thanked the gods, tipped the wise woman, and sipped the brew with your eyes closed. Because even if it wasn't real, it felt like protection. And sometimes that's enough. The inn is nearly silent now, just the pop of coals in the hearth and the soft shuffle of a broom somewhere behind the counter. You sit alone, staring into your drink, when the old man 2 stools down mutters, without looking up, "They're not all dead, you know." You glance over. The dragons. They just went into hiding. It's a statement said with such certainty you almost believe him. Because in the medieval mind, dragons weren't extinct. They were elusive. Unlike other monsters which had to be slain or banished or locked away in old myths, dragons had a habit of simply disappearing into caves, into mountains, into lakes so deep the moonlight never touched bottom. They weren't gone. They were waiting, sleeping, watching, and maybe, just maybe, planning a return. This idea shows up again and again in medieval texts, especially toward the later Middle Ages, when natural philosophy began bumping up against folklore. Scholars and scribes. People who should have known better occasionally included caveats in their writings. Things like the dragon has not been seen in these parts for 100 years. Not died out, not imaginary, just not seen, which is very different from doesn't exist. Some monks even recorded second-hand dragon sightings with the same tone they used for weather or eclipses. One entry in a 14th century abbey journal reads, "A beast of long body and hot breath was glimpsed in the eastern wood. No further sign, no panic, no ridicule, just data." That's how casually dragons lingered on the edge of the real. Historians still argue whether this long tale of belief was due to genuine superstition or a kind of cultural comfort. Dragons explained things. Their presence gave shape to fear, to ambition, to mystery. Saying they were still out there made the world feel bigger, deeper, a little less tame, and of course the geography helped. Europe had, and still has, no shortage of craggy peaks, forested valleys, and impossible ravines, places where anything could hide if it really wanted to, especially if that anything was smart, ancient, and maybe a little bit magical. Quirky local legends sprang up like mushrooms after rain. In the Pyrenees, villagers swore a dragon lived in the mist that clung to the ridges. In the Highlands of Scotland, tales told of a sleeping worm beneath the loch seen only once a generation, usually by someone who died mysteriously shortly after. In the forests of Bohemia, old women warned children not to stray too far, or the old tale would find them. No one said dragon, but no one had to. and not all the dragons in hiding were threats. Some were protectors. A few stories claimed that a dragon had taken up residence near a village not to consume it, but to guard it, from what no one ever said. But there was always the implication that things could be worse, that the dragon was keeping other things out. This belief in secret surviving dragons bled into the politics of the age, too. Banners still bore dragon symbols. Bloodlines claimed to have worm ancestry. One German count even insisted that his family was watched over by an invisible sky serpent, which appeared only during sieges. Conveniently, it never appeared when they lost. The church was conflicted. On one hand, dragons were evil, tied to Satan's sin and pagan chaos. On the other, if they were still out there, could they be saved? Could a dragon be converted, baptized? One theologian wrote dead, serious, that should a dragon show true repentance, it might be allowed an entry into heaven, assuming it could fit through the gates. Artists, meanwhile, kept drawing them, not as past beasts, but as present possibilities. In the margins of Bibles, on the undersides of pews, in carvings on village wells. They appeared as if to say, "We're still here, just not when you're looking." Some alchemical texts even warned that dragons were masters of concealment, capable of blending into earth or water. One recipe insists that to reveal a hiding dragon, you must burn 7 reeds of sweet oil and chant thrice the name of the beast. What name? The text is conveniently torn. Even now, you'll find places in Europe with names like Dragon's Hollow, or Worm's Rest, or Drakenwald, echoes of a time when maps didn't just chart rivers and roads, but reputation. When it was understood that some places weren't empty, they were occupied, quietly. And if you listened hard enough, really listened, you might hear breathing beneath the stones. You shift in your seat at the inn now. The old man has vanished as quietly as he arrived. Outside, the wind has picked up, brushing along the windows like a tail. The fire hisses low, and you can't help but wonder, what if they're just waiting for us to forget? Dawn breaks over rolling hills, the mist still clinging to the grass, like a ghost unwilling to let go. In the distance, you hear church bells and closer laughter. Children run along a stone path, chasing each other with sticks. One of them shouting, "You be the dragon, I'm the knight." And you realize this isn't just a game. It's memory-made myth rooted in the land. Because in Europe, there are still places that whisper of dragons. Welcome to the real-world trail of famous dragon spots. Even centuries later, entire towns, rivers, hills, and caves still bear the marks of their legendary reptiles. Whether or not a dragon ever drew breath, the geography remembers. Start with Wales, whose national flag still boasts a red dragon, the Wyverns Goch. It's said to have slept beneath the hill of Dinas Emrys, battling a white dragon in the earth, while King Vortigern tried and failed to build his castle above. Every day the walls collapsed until young Merlin, yes, that Merlin explained that the dragons were fighting underneath. Dig deeper, he said, and find them. And so they did. That hill is real. You can climb it. And if you listen closely, locals say you might still hear a low rumble underfoot. Probably a geological shift. probably. Then there's Krakow, Poland, home to the infamous Wawel dragon, or Smoke Wawelski. His tale is legend, a beast who devoured livestock, demanded virgins, and finally met his match when a clever shoemaker stuffed a lamb with sulfur. The dragon exploded. The city rejoiced. Today, a dragon statue stands near Wawel Castle, and yes, it breathes fire. Every few minutes, tourists love it, children cheer, and deep down, even adults find themselves glancing at the Vistula River, wondering. Move west, and you'll find Klosterneuburg, Austria, where a dragon tooth hangs inside a monastery, most likely a fossilized mammoth tusk, but no one calls it that. They call it Drakensson, and they nod when asked if it's real. In England, dragons dot the countryside like forgotten cousins. The Lambton worm coiled around a hill in County Durham. The Sockburn worm terrorized fields near the River Tees, slain by a sword that had to be presented to every new bishop of Durham. It's still tradition, still reenacted. And in Sussex, a tale tells of the Knucker, a water dragon, who lived in a deep pool, Knucker Hole. There are several across England, all bearing that name, all with similar tales, a beast in the water, a battle, a mysterious death. One church even claims to have the slayer's gravestone cracked and moss-covered near the altar. Historians still argue whether these spots were built around the stories or the stories wrapped around the spots. Did a deep hole inspire a tale, or did a tale make a hole important? Either way, the land carries the legend. Quirky footnote, street names. Across Europe, you'll find Dragon Lane, Worm Hill, Drakenstein. These aren't just relics, they're linguistic fossils. Survivors. In Slovenia, a dragon graces the bridge in Ljubljana, snarling stone-faced at passing cars. Locals say if a virgin crosses the bridge, the dragons wag their tails. No one's confirmed it, but everyone smiles a little when they walk by. And of course, mountains. Dragons love a view. In the Alps, there are multiple tales of drakes nesting on cliffs, their roars echoing down into goat-dotted valleys. In the Carpathians, they're said to still sleep beneath specific crags, restless but dormant. Hikers occasionally find dragon scales, fossilized shells, or layered rocks. Children collect them. Parents nod. Best not to bring too many home, they say. Some places combine myth and monument. In Rouen, France, there's the Church of Saint Romanus, who supposedly tamed the gargouille, a dragon that flooded the Seine. He led it subdued into the town. They burned it, mounted its head on the wall. Later, it evolved into the gargoyle guardian figure stone, Sentinel. You see them now on cathedrals everywhere. Dragons turned watchful. These spots weren't just places where dragons died. They were where they left fingerprints. Their shape lingers in local festivals, in bakery names and soccer club mascots. People dress as dragons, bake dragon bread, parade enormous papier-mâché beasts through town squares, terrifying to toddlers, hilarious to teens, and nostalgic for adults who once believed. And you begin to understand dragons may never have existed in the flesh, but they inhabit the world through story, through stone, through the way a mountain looks a little too much like a sleeping giant, through the way a fog rolls in just right, and you swear you saw wings. You crest a hill now looking down over a village tucked between green hills and a winding stream. Somewhere in that town is a weathered statue. Somewhere else, a tooth, a tail, a name. And whether they know it or not, the people below still live in the shadow of dragons. Because even when they're gone, they leave a mark. And the map always remembers. You're standing in the middle of a bustling market square, wooden stalls creaking under heaps of cloth herbs, and bread still steaming from the oven. And then you spot it, a book bound in cracked leather on a merchant's table. The cover is stamped with a coiled serpent wings, outstretched, a bestiary the merchant says eyes gleaming. Dragons, and all their kind. You flip it open. The drawings are beautiful, the descriptions wild. And the deeper you go, the more you realize this isn't just art, it's medieval taxonomy gone rogue. You've entered the world of dragon classification, the medieval version. To a modern biologist, a dragon is a biological impossibility. No warm-blooded vertebrate should be able to fly, breathe fire, and hoard treasure while also growing to the size of a windmill. But to medieval thinkers, dragons were as real and classifiable as dogs or goats. You just had to know the types. One of the most widely accepted distinctions came from the Latin bestiaries copied and recopied in monasteries across Europe. They offered a handy breakdown, Draco, the classic winged fire-breathing serpent, often found in deserts or near gold mines, because of course dragons liked shiny things, said to attack elephants by wrapping around them and suffocating them because medieval scribes never let scale get in the way of a good story. Wyverns smaller, two-legged and more agile. Frequently associated with disease, its presence supposedly brought plague. Often seen on coats of arms because nothing says leadership like Pestilence on wings. Worm serpentine, wingless, often earthbound. These were the slow, burrowing kind, more likely to haunt marshes or tombs. Think haunted garden hose with an attitude. Amphiptere, a rarer breed snake-like but with feathered wings, usually more decorative than deadly. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic or the result of someone misreading a particularly bad drawing. Lindworm, a limbless or two-legged creature found mostly in Germanic tales, often a sign of impending doom, or indigestion, possibly both. These classifications weren't consistent across regions, but the general structure persisted. Some bestiaries even included notes on behavior, how each type might react to humans, what offerings could appease them, and whether you should run or kneel. Spoiler, you should probably run. Quirky twist. Color mattered. A red dragon signified wrath or war. A green one hinted at poison or envy. A gold dragon, possibly divine, possibly greedy, it depended on the monk's mood. Some believed black dragons were the oldest and wisest, while white ones were omens of change. Basically, if you saw a Drachen, the first thing to do was assess the color palette, and then panic accordingly. Many medieval thinkers borrowed from Pliny the Elder or Isidore of Seville, whose descriptions were dutifully recopied for centuries. Pliny insisted dragons came from India and drank the milk of elephants. Isidore claimed they had a crest upon their heads and were the greatest of serpents. Neither had seen a dragon, but both were confident. Then came the alchemists, who couldn't resist a good metaphor. To them, dragons weren't just creatures, they were symbols of transformation. The green dragon represented the base material before transmutation. The red dragon was the philosopher's fire. Entire texts were written in code, using dragons to describe stages of alchemical progress. If you ever read something like "Burn the White Dragon's Bones" under Saturn's hour, you weren't dealing with fantasy. You were reading chemistry in disguise. Heraldry, meanwhile, gave dragons even more structure. A dragon passant walking was different from a dragon rampant rearing, and families obsessed over whether their crest had a wyvern or a drake. Imagine arguing at dinner about whether your ancestor rode a two-legged beast or four. This wasn't trivia, it was identity. Historians still argue whether these classifications reflected real belief or were just a way to organize a flood of folklore. But given how seriously they're presented, how many margins are filled with sketches and notes, it's hard not to believe these scholars truly tried to make sense of the impossible. And let's not forget the moral overlays. Every type of dragon carried a lesson. The greedy Draco reminded you of the sin of avarice. The sneaky worm warned against deceit. The proud wyvern taught humility often by devouring the proud. Bestiaries weren't just medieval field guides. They were ethical manuals dressed up in scales and wings. Today we might classify dragons in terms of fantasy genres or role-playing game stats. But the medievals did it with intent, to explain, to instruct, and maybe to guard against the chance that one day they'd encounter a real one. So next time you dream of a dragon, try to remember, did it have wings? Claws? What color were its eyes? Because somewhere in an old book in a forgotten library, there's a chart, and it knows exactly which kind of trouble you're in. The parchment is old brittle at the corners, and the ink has bled into sepia stains. But the symbols, they still shimmer faintly, as if resisting the centuries. A curved tail, a pair of wings, a loop of fire, and somewhere near the bottom a warning in Latin. He who awakens the beast will not sleep again. Charming, you've stumbled into the world of rituals, relics, and relic hunting, because for medieval believers, dragons weren't just observed or feared, they were summoned or buried or collected in very strange ways. Welcome to the occult side of dragon lore. While peasants might whisper about monsters in the woods, and knights might swing swords in search of glory sorcerers, and scholars went looking for dragons with very different goals, not to slay them, but to use them, or at least their bones, breath, or essence. Take the Book of Solomon, a favorite among esoteric circles. One version describes a ritual of containment involving a circle of salt, 7 candles, and the name of a dragon whispered backward under a blood moon. Not exactly bedtime reading. Other grimoires from the 13th to 15th centuries describe rituals to speak with dragons or to extract power from their lairs. Sometimes the dragon was code for a powerful spirit. Other times, who knows, quirky twist. Some of these spells were booby-trapped. On purpose. A 14th century text known as the Codex Ardens includes a page titled Draconis Sigillum, the Seal of the Dragon. If read aloud in the wrong order, it promised to summon not a dragon, but endless bad luck and an upset stomach. Sorcerer humor was dark. But not all engagements with dragons were magical. Some were monastic. Many abbeys claimed to possess relics of slain dragons. A scale here, a claw there. One monastery in northern Italy proudly displayed what they called a dragon vertebra, though modern historians think it was just a chunk of whalebone with great PR. These relics weren't just curiosities, they were pilgrimage destinations. People traveled days, even weeks, to kneel before the tooth of a dragon, hoping it would cure epilepsy, protect against plague, or keep nightmares at bay. Did it work? Hard to say. But the innkeepers nearby certainly slept well. And then there were the hunters, not knights, but scholars often accompanied by half-mad alchemists or overly enthusiastic scribes. They scoured ancient texts and maps for signs of dragon tombs. Old legends were cross-referenced with real terrain. A cave that once smoked, a hill shaped like a sleeping beast worth digging. One infamous expedition in the early 1300s claimed to have unearthed a dragon's skull the size of a barrel in the Pyrenees. It was later identified as a fossilized elephant head, but not before 3 towns had minted coins with dragon emblems, and one bishop declared the beast an enemy of the church, retroactively excommunicating it. That's commitment. Historians still argue whether some of these relic hunters truly believed or were simply chasing prestige. After all, owning a dragon relic gave your town or abbey a leg up in everything from trade to tourism. Medieval clout, if you will. And some relics were created, not found. Enterprising monks would carve bone, polish it smooth, and bury it in the garden only to miraculously discover it weeks later. Suddenly, donations rose, pilgrims poured in, and no one asked why the dragon's horn looked suspiciously like a cow femur. Even the rituals of protection evolved over time. While early dragon tales emphasized sword and shield, later medieval households kept charms, tiny lead tokens etched with dragon sigils worn around the neck or hidden under floorboards. Some were shaped like miniature dragons, devouring their own tails, Ouroboros a symbol of eternal defense. Others bore Latin prayers warped into riddles, half blessing, half puzzle. Then there's the ritual of rebuke. If a family believed a dragon spirit haunted their land, they might hire a priest to conduct a casting out. This involved holy water incense and reading from the Book of Job, because Leviathan, obviously. The most famous case took place in Burgundy, where a farmer blamed crop failures on a buried dragon egg. The ritual failed. The harvest didn't improve. The farmer became a brewer instead. One of the strangest texts of the era, the Draconis Codex, describes an even more bizarre belief that dragons, if summoned correctly, could act as guardians, not destroyers, but only if appeased regularly. The suggested offering, the blood of a rooster, the feather of a crow, and a tale well told. You can guess which part was hardest to come by. And just when you think it couldn't get weirder, you find tales of dragon burials. Yes, burials. Some stories suggest that after slaying a dragon, it wasn't enough to leave it rotting in a cave. You had to bury it properly, far from water, under iron crosses, with prayers spoken in reverse. If not, its spirit might linger, or worse, return. Undead dragons. Just what your village needed. One such grave still exists in southern France, a low mound marked by 3 black stones and an inscription no one has translated. Locals call it La Tête du Feu, the head of fire. No one farms too close. You close the book now. The market has thinned. The merchant is gone. But the symbol of the dragon remains coiled waiting, and somewhere deep in the forgotten corners of Europe, a lock clicks open. A ritual is whispered, and a relic changes hands. Because dragons never really die. They're archived. You've wandered into a small chapel, stone walls, worn smooth by centuries of whispered prayers. Above the altar, instead of saints or angels, there's a fresco. Faded but unmistakable, a dragon curled in the corner of a mountain, gazing out at a kneeling figure with a golden halo. No sword, no fire, just a strange, calm gaze exchanged between beast and man. And in that moment, you realize not all dragons were enemies. Some were teachers. Because while most medieval minds saw dragons as dangers, a surprising few saw them as symbols of wisdom, even spirituality. Let's start with the paradox dragons, as holy metaphors. Sure, dragons were usually associated with evil. Saint George slayed one after all. The book of Revelation called Satan himself the great dragon. But humans are nothing if not contradictory. And the more monks and mystics looked at dragons, the more they saw something more than just a monster. In early Christian allegory, dragons became representations of sin, but not simply to be feared. They were to be confronted, faced down, mastered. To slay your inner dragon was to overcome pride, gluttony, or lust. And so the beast became the battle, not just of blade and flame, but of conscience. Some mystics took it further. In cloistered manuscripts, you'll find passages describing dragons as guardians of divine truths, creatures who held secrets too great for the unworthy. They were not evil, but tests. If you could approach a dragon with humility, faith, and clarity of heart, it would not destroy you. It might even speak. One such tale, tucked into the writings of a 12th century Cistercian monk, tells of a hermit who fasted for 40 days atop a mountain. On the final night, he saw a dragon curled at the summit, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The creature opened its eyes and whispered, "The treasure you seek is within." Then it vanished. Historians still argue whether that passage was literal visionary or symbolic, but it inspired dozens of similar accounts where dragons were not demons, but thresholds. Then came the Gnostic interpretations. To these fringe thinkers, the dragon represented the serpent of knowledge, not of temptation, a bridge between the material and the mystical. Some even claimed Jesus himself had ridden the dragon of flesh to descend into the mortal world, a poetic way of saying he embraced suffering for understanding. It didn't catch on with the church for obvious reasons, but the idea lingered in alchemical texts where dragons symbolized transformation, not just physically, but spiritually. The green dragon was the ego, fierce and untamed. The red dragon was the purified self, powerful, focused, transcendent. Slaying the dragon, too simplistic. The goal was to integrate it. Quirky moment. In one bizarre German alchemical scroll, a man is shown hugging a dragon, not fighting, not fleeing, just embracing it as it coils gently around him. The caption reads, "He who loves the flame becomes the flame." It wasn't just mystics and monks. Some heretics condemned now, but fascinating, saw dragons as fallen angels who chose to live among men, not out of rebellion, but out of curiosity. They believed these beings taught ancient wisdom before being driven into hiding by fearful humans. You can see echoes of this in the Celtic myths, where dragons weren't evil at all. They were ancient spirits of the land guardians of rivers, mountains, or forests. Killing one was seen as a desecration, not a victory. Some chieftains were said to commune with dragon spirits for guidance before battle. In Welsh tradition, the red dragon wasn't just a symbol of power. It was a prophecy. The Mabinogion tells of a red and white dragon locked in battle, symbolizing the struggle between native Britons and foreign invaders. The red dragon, of course, triumphs, a sign of hope, of survival. Even in medieval dream interpretation manuals, dragons weren't always bad. To dream of fighting a dragon meant you were wrestling with temptation. But to dream of riding a dragon, that meant victory over your baser self, or sometimes just indigestion, depends on the scribe. Still, the idea stuck the dragon within. More than a beast to be feared, it became a metaphor for your shadow, your secrets, your doubts, and yes, your power. Some abbots even preached that to become holy, one must first descend into the dragon's cave to face what lies beneath before rising transformed. And isn't that the oldest story in the world? To descend, confront, and emerge anew. So now, standing in that chapel, you look again at the fresco, not as a warning, but as a mirror. The dragon watches, not with rage, but with recognition, because maybe, just maybe, it's been waiting not to strike, but to speak. The moon is high now, and you've followed an old stone path out of the village. The wind carries the scent of wild thyme, and something else older, dustier. The stars overhead burn clear, and as you crest a low hill, you see it, a ring of standing stones. Not grand like Stonehenge, but weathered, worn, and whispering. In the center, a slab etched with spirals and something vaguely serpentine. You've arrived at one of many forgotten dragon sites, places where belief once burned bright, but has since been buried under centuries of silence. Here in these obscure corners of medieval memory lie tales that didn't make it into textbooks or cathedral stained glass. But that doesn't mean they're any less powerful or strange. Let's begin with the Church of the Hollow Flame, a barely documented 11th century sect in southern France. They believed dragons were divine messengers sent to test the faithful with fear. Every solstice, they lit massive bonfires and told tales of Le Feu Silencieux, a silent dragon of smoke, who they claimed once saved their valley from raiders by descending as a cloud and confusing the invaders. There's no record of what exactly they burned in those fires. Probably best not to ask. Then there's the Cave of Whispering Wings in the Black Forest of Germany. Locals avoided it for centuries, saying strange winds came from within winds that sounded almost like breathing. In 1423, a group of monks from a nearby abbey attempted to map the cave. Only one returned raving about eyes in the dark that remembered before memory. He became a recluse, drew dragons in the margins of every book he touched, and refused to sleep indoors ever again. A fringe theory suggests this story was an early expression of subterranean echo chambers. But let's be honest, whispering memory eyes is far more fun. In the British Isles, forgotten dragon tales are often tangled with fairy lore. One Devonshire myth speaks of the coiling hill, a small rise in the earth that locals swore used to breathe. If you walked its spiral path counterclockwise at dusk, the ground was said to shift beneath your feet. Today, it's a sheep pasture. The sheep don't talk about it. A similar hill in Ireland, and Connacht Sith, was said to house a sleeping dragon who only stirred when the nearby river rose too high. When it did, people claimed the rain fell warmer, as if the sky were sweating. Historians still argue whether this was meteorological coincidence or a folk memory of geothermal vents. Either way, it was cause for cider and storytelling. Quirky detail, a now lost manuscript from a traveling scribe in the 1300s, cataloged 48 dragon-haunted locations across Europe. Only 2 survive in partial translation. One lists the blinking tree of Norwich, which allegedly grew eyes each Lent, and another describes the well that once boiled without fire. Neither site has been verified, but you better believe there's a podcast series trying. In remote Italy, villagers once spoke of La Fiamma della Rocca, a flame that danced atop a mountain cave every equinox. Some said it was volcanic gas. Others insisted it was a dragon's breath escaping through the cracks. A few bold or foolish locals tried to capture it in bottles, convinced the flame could cure melancholy. Spoiler, it didn't. Historians still debate whether these lesser-known sites were remnants of pre-Christian beliefs, exaggerations of natural phenomena, or simply very committed local tourism strategies. But one thing is clear: dragons left footprints not just in stone and story, but in how people moved through the world. Even medieval pilgrim routes sometimes detoured through dragon-haunted valleys or caves, not because of danger, but because of reverence. Some believed walking near a dragon's lair, even one long silent, could protect you from illness or theft. A kind of medieval spiritual radiation, maybe not FDA approved, but popular all the same. And let's not forget the forgotten shrines. A handful of overgrown ruins across Eastern Europe were once believed to be sanctuaries, not to saints, but to dragons. Statues with scales, altars shaped like wings. A few even had dragon-shaped wind vanes on top, which seems like asking for trouble in a storm. One of the most mysterious is a crumbling stone outpost in the Carpathians, known only as Drakvenia, a name no local claims to have invented, but which shows up in 14th century maps with a single annotation, guarded by fire. The site has been the subject of several possibly cursed archaeological expeditions, none of which returned with more than bad photographs and great ghost stories. And yet, despite how thoroughly history tried to pave over these places through wars, plagues, and reformation, Some whispers linger. Children still dare each other to run around the sleeping mound at night. Farmers still mutter about the warm wind before a storm. And travelers lost on winding back roads sometimes find stone circles no GPS can locate. Just sitting there, waiting, you step out of the stone ring. The grass brushes your legs. Somewhere behind you, the wind sighs through the rocks. You turn, but there's nothing there, except maybe, just maybe, a shadow in the corner of your eye. The sun is rising now low and golden, stretching long shadows across the cobbled street as you pass beneath an ancient archway. There, chiseled into stone, barely visible after centuries of wear, is a familiar shape, wings coiled, tail open jaws. A dragon, not roaring, not flying, just there, watching, and it hits you. Dragons weren't just painted in books or whispered about in forests. They were carved into the very fabric of medieval life, embedded in cities, customs, and everyday thought. You've reached the final layer, how dragons shaped the medieval imagination, not just as monsters, not even as symbols, but as foundations of worldview. Let's begin with architecture. Many medieval cathedrals feature gargoyles, grotesque stone figures used as both decorative sculpture and functional waterspouts. But have you noticed how many look suspiciously? Reptilian long necks, clawed feet, scaled hides. Some even have wings. The dragon reimagined in limestone. These weren't just artistic flair. To medieval masons, gargoyles served to ward off evil. Ironically, they were the monsters meant to protect against other monsters. A kind of medieval logic fight fire with fire-breathing stone. Meanwhile, in public festivals, dragons made regular appearances. The most famous, the Tarasque Festival in southern France, based on a local legend of a river-dwelling dragon subdued by a saint. Every year, villagers paraded a massive dragon effigy through the streets, not as a threat, but as a cherished tradition. Children cheered. Bakers sold dragon bread. Somewhere along the way, the beast became a mascot. Quirky twist. In 1457, the festival dragon in Tarascon broke loose, rolled downhill, and ate 2 barrels of wine and 1 unlucky fruit vendor's cart. Nobody was hurt, but the town mayor later added reins to the costume. Safety first, even with papier-mâché monsters. You'll also find shriekens in medieval law and folklore, especially around land ownership. Some deeds included curious clauses, like may not awaken the beast below, or may not disturb the slumbering tail. These weren't legal metaphors. They were genuine restrictions based on fear or belief that the land contained a sleeping dragon. Some modern landowners still honor these ancient clauses out of tradition, or superstition, or because digging up a dragon sounds expensive. And then there's language. The word dragon itself comes from the Greek drakon, meaning to see clearly, or the watching one. That's not coincidental. Medieval people didn't just see dragons as threats. They believed dragons saw them, judged them, stalked them in dreams. Protected treasure not just for wealth, but because they understood its danger. Dragons were wisdom with claws. Some even claimed to dream of dragons regularly. One 13th century friar wrote that dragons visited him in his sleep, offering riddles and warnings. When he ignored them, he got sick. When he listened, he healed. Historians still argue whether this was a case of psychosomatic health or just really persuasive lizards. In medieval education, dragons often appeared in moral instruction. A child learning to read might be given a text about a noble knight who fights a dragon not because it's evil, but because it hoards books. The lesson, share your knowledge, or else. Even maps were shaped by dragons. We've all heard the phrase, here be dragons. While only a few maps actually include that specific line, many early medieval Mappe Mundi world maps included serpent-like creatures along the margins, not just to decorate, but to say this is the edge of the known world. Beyond this, anything is possible, and in that spirit, dragons became the guardians of boundaries between man and beast, between known and unknown, between sacred and profane. They stood at the threshold of every important story, sometimes to be defeated, sometimes to be befriended, but always to be acknowledged. Without them, the tale wouldn't start or end. One scholar calls dragons the default punctuation of myth. A dragon arrives when the world needs to change, or be tested, or burned down and rebuilt. Which brings us to dream logic, because in the medieval mind, dragons weren't just physical beasts, they were dream mechanisms. Archetypes. The moment you dared to imagine something greater than yourself, you risked conjuring a dragon. Not out of fear, but because you were finally thinking big enough to merit one. And so they were everywhere, carved into lintels, woven into tapestries, scribbled in margins by bored monks, whispered into lullabies, prayed against, danced with, dreamed of, a constant companion to the medieval mind, and perhaps to yours. Because as you walk back through the archway, the light growing brighter, the street waking up, you notice something. On a cracked stone near your feet, a tiny engraving, a loop, a curve, a claw, faint but unmistakable. They were here. They're still here, watching. The road bends gently now, leading you down into a fog-kissed valley. Morning is just beginning to hum, to life. Distant bells ring, roosters shout their opinions into the damp air, and chimney smoke curls upward like tiny dragon tails. But this right here is where our journey ends. Not in battle, not with fire, but with a whisper and a question that's lingered through every tale, myth and mural. Were the dragons ever real? You step onto soft earth. Dew clings to your boots. Around you, the world feels quieter than it should. Not empty, just listening. Because the truth is, medieval people didn't wonder if dragons existed. They wondered where and when and whether they'd come back. Their maps weren't filled with maybes. They were etched with certainty, serpents along the sea's edge, wyverns in the wastelands, great beasts tucked into caves near known towns. Dragons were not a fantasy. They were a fact so widely accepted that denying them would have sounded silly, like denying thunder or the Pope. What made them real wasn't fossil evidence or zoological proof. It was the function they served. Dragons gave shape to fear. They explained the unexplainable crop failures, sudden storms, mysterious deaths. They justified heroism and demanded storytelling. They lived in that beautiful middle space between the physical and the metaphorical, where all the best monsters roam. And for every serious treatise on slaying dragons, there was a child drawing one in the dirt, a baker naming his loaves after dragon fire, a nun scribbling a serpent in her margins, not because it was required, but because it felt natural. Quirky fact, one 14th century village elected a dragon mayor every spring, a child dressed in robes who got to decide where the festival pies were hidden. Their motto, only the dragon knows. It's adorable and mildly terrifying, just like a good myth. Historians still argue whether dragons were rooted in dinosaur bones, misidentified crocodiles, or pure imagination. But those debates miss the point. Dragons were emotional architecture. They were how medieval people navigated the world's wild edges. They taught caution, courage, and the cost of arrogance. They guarded treasure not to be hoarded, but to be earned. They slept beneath hills, not because they were lazy, but because the land itself held memory. And in some ways, don't they still, every time you fear the unknown, you awaken a little dragon? Every time you chase a dream, you ride one. Every time you imagine something bigger than yourself, something with claws and wings and the ability to burn it all down or lift you to new heights, you're doing what people have always done. You're speaking dragon, and dragons, they listen. So you take one last look at the valley. Maybe you see a shape move in the mist. Maybe you don't. Either way, the tale has been told. And now it's yours to dream. 300 words. The path fades behind you as the mist thickens, softening the sharp corners of the waking world. Trees blur into smudges of charcoal. The breeze, once cool, now hums low, like distant breath. Every step feels quieter, slower, as if the land itself is winding down beside you. You've traveled far tonight, across fire-scorched hills and candlelit abbeys, through dream-touched forests and forgotten stone rings. You've stood before ancient frescoes and breathed in the ash of myths. You've walked in the shadow of dragons, not to run or fight, but simply to understand. And now, there's no need to hurry. Let your thoughts drift. Let the stories settle like dust in a library. Let the dragons curl once more into sleep, their wings tucked gently beneath the soil, their eyes soft with memory. If you feel something lingering at the edge of your dreams tonight, a flicker of gold, a gust of warm wind, the faintest curl of smoke, you're not alone. You're part of something older, wiser, coiled just beneath the surface. So breathe slow, sink deep, and remember, the dragons are watching, not to harm, but to guard your sleep. Good night, wanderer. Word count 300. Set.